2 hours allocated for this. We might end early, we might end late. I think a lot of it depends on how many questions you ask. I have like 5 separate decks here. It's really not possible to go through all of that stuff in 2 hours. It's probably about 4 hours of content if I went through it really carefully. But because you're all here at WUDC, I expect that what you're looking for is not a from the ground up how to make your principal argument, but maybe a bit more in terms of like emergency rescue in situations where you need to make a principal but you're not sure. It seems to me this is a bit late, right, for you to start trying to make principal arguments. The problem is that all these decks are structured in the form of teaching you how to make them from the ground up, so I will try to go through some of that stuff, but slightly more efficiently. There's a bunch of things we can talk about. So there's the general guide, which I think we should definitely go through. And then there's going to be stuff on utilitarianism, on choice, on human rights, on the criminal justice system. If anyone here thinks that any one of those 4 topics we should spend more time on, let me know. If at any point during this lecture you have a question or something doesn't make sense, please let me know as well. I hope to make this as interactive as we can make it. Yeah, apart from that, I'm just going to go straight into it. And yes, some of you might have seen the stuff on YouTube already. The content is similar, but basically a lot more detailed, is the long and short of it. But this first bit is going to be new. So what we should just cover at the beginning, and I hope we can go through this stuff relatively efficiently. Why should you know principal arguments? The second one is quite important. I think especially, I see this more among school kids, but I've seen it happen at university level as well. People get a bit too excited about knowing a principal argument, and then they whip it out at the earliest possible opportunity. That sometimes results in slightly unfortunate results. So when should you actually try and use them? What you should use them for? There are only 2 functions a principal argument can ever have, and I think that's a very good test for when you should actually know them. Then the basic ways of proving a principle. So at a high level of generality, how you should think about proving them, and then some basic tips. Actually, the last bullet point might be the single most important thing, given you're already at the World Championship. But let's see. Okay, so why are principal arguments? This is just brief. It's just here to make me feel good, okay? Because I like principal arguments, and I hope you like them too. Alright, so just from a pure intellectual perspective, they are some of the most interesting and difficult and deep arguments there are. Like, in a fundamental sense, nothing can matter unless a principal argument in some way tells you that it matters. Debate-wise, you know that you've got good debating technique when you can actually make a principal argument. Principal arguments, and this will come out later when we talk about the guidelines, place an extremely high premium on you knowing exactly what you're doing. If you make a practical argument and you mess it up 20%, the judge is going to credit it. If you make a principal argument and you mess it up 20%, it's probably going to be close to a complete waste of time. Which is why, again, if you're going to make your principal argument for the first time in this tournament, it's going to be a bit risky, but you know, why not try anyway? The third thing is principles are where high stakes live. The key thing to realize here is that even if your case is not built around a principle, often all the big rhetoric is principle, even if you're running a purely practical case. And hopefully we'll see some examples of how, even if you run a case which is not explicitly principled, the rhetoric you can get from it, the big ideas can help you out a fair bit. And lastly, this has been my general observation, principal debates tend to get a bit more common the better you are at debating. So late out rounds of big tournaments, finals, semi-finals, you tend to see 1 or 2 debates which are maybe not standard set-piece principal debates, but there's usually one good principal argument on at least one side of the debate, which gives you a fairly clear shot at the victory. Alright, again, just to be very clear, every debate about what you ought to do is principled in the sense that you're arguing about what people ought to do. Right? The real issue why most debates don't look principled is because usually people in a debate agree on what right and wrong is. So if people agree on what right and wrong is, then you don't have a debate about what right and wrong is. A principle is basically an argument about how we should evaluate right and wrong, what we ought or ought not do, what is better or worse in some absolute normative sense. If you agree on it, then you don't have a principle. But very often, even if the debate does not require it, it's very good to ask whether or not one side's particular framework for what counts as good or bad is correct. Or maybe if it's correct, to ask whether it's actually complete. It might not be. Okay? So just bear that in mind. So let's talk about when to make principal arguments. Now, as a purely sociological fact, judges are primed to expect principal arguments in certain kinds of debates, and we're going to see what those are. It is very hard to make a principal argument when the debate is not the kind of debate in which people will expect a principled argument. So don't just run a principle because it theoretically makes sense. And I've done this before, but it was really just for shits and giggles. You don't actually do this in a debate where you're trying to win. Okay, so if the debate is about, I don't know, so that's an example. This House would bar individuals above age 60 from running for political office. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to make an argument that free will does not exist. Either because the universe is deterministic, in which case you never had a choice, or the universe is random and stochastic, in which case, yes, you have choice, but it's meaningless because it all comes from the quantum frothing in the electrons in your brain, right? It's a sound argument. It does technically, if you think about it logically, it defeats the argument about voter choice. I'm not sure you would get much credit for it. Now, I have actually done this before, but that was just for fun. Okay, so some people have told me, yeah, I saw the HWS debate where you did that thing once upon a time in 2016, and I'm like, we were not doing that in a serious way. Please do not do that. So this is just a bit of a warning. Okay, don't just make them because they might theoretically work. So, what are the two ways of determining when a principal argument might be appropriate? The first is look at the actual subject matter of the debate. Okay? So there are certain topics which are morality coded. So debates about democracy are in fact incredibly standard set of principles apply. You might have heard about the state power principle, for instance. That's one you really ought to know inside out. The principle of incommensurability, which we might not have time to talk about in detail, you can ask me about it, is also one of the classic arguments for democracy. All debates about reparations and redistribution are actually debates about utilitarianism versus something else, with utilitarianism usually being on the anti-reparation side. Okay? Debates about immigration, obligations to citizens vis-a-vis non-citizens, debates about criminal justice, all of these debates are kind of morality coded. So you should seriously consider the possibility that a principal argument might help you out on either side of debates about these topics. 2, when the debate motion itself makes an explicit appeal to an ethical concept. So if the word duty, obligation, legitimate, responsible for appears in the motion, there usually is a principal argument living somewhere inside of it. And you need to realize that these words don't all imply the same thing, yeah? Saying that something is legitimate is very different from saying that something is good. Saying that it is permissible for freedom fighters to commit war crimes is very different from saying that is a good or recommended course of action, even in the majority of instances. And you will be shocked how just clarifying exactly what that word means will radically shift the distribution of argumentative burdens in a debate. Okay, so debates about moral enhancement drugs, debates about animal rights, these things should immediately clue you in that something principled is going on. And the last category, if you want to look at subject matter, is things which are kind of speculative, kind of far out, kind of wild. Right? So far out concept hypotheticals, a world governed by AI, that's come out in some major finals. Are we redesigning human nature? Are we saying you have the right to modify your memory? Are we implanting things in people's brains? Are we regretting the human capacity to feel anger? Right? You should ask yourself, so if you get emotion, like, for instance, this house regrets the human capacity to feel anger, you can obviously think of many great practical arguments on both sides, but definitely a key part of your prep process should be, is anger an indispensable part of our moral reasoning in certain respects? Does anger point us towards certain moral concepts which we otherwise could not get to without the concept of anger, for instance? And if you think in these terms, you'll probably come up with something at least half usable. So I've seen debates where I think one team successfully argued that anger is very useful because anger as an emotion can only be felt towards agents. Like, you can be frustrated if you're stuck in a jam, or like a thunderstorm means a holiday is ruined. It doesn't entirely make sense to be angry at the thunderstorm because it's ruining your day. So anger seems to have an agentic respect to it, which might then suggest that anger is part of how we think about reparative duties, or redistribution, or retribution, or reparations, whatever. Right? So these are just things to kind of bear in mind. The second way to figure out if a debate is principled is that instead of looking at the content, you kind of look at what, in a more abstract sense, the strategic demands of the debate are. So the really classic example, which hopefully you're familiar with, is debates which place absolute burdens on one side. So if the motion contains the words always, never, universal, or at least implies these things, you want to consider whether there is a principle which covers the ground. The reason why principles are so useful in absolute debates is because principles allow for you to deal with the most pathological consequences of the things you are espousing by saying we don't care about the consequences, or at least we don't care about the consequences as much in that particular case. Yeah? When you're defending extreme action, so classic cases, defending Marxist revolution, right? The example I just gave you. Freedom fighters are not obliged to follow the rules of war. Does anyone, by the way, know the standard arguments for how we justify terrorism from a principled just angle? Anyone can volunteer? Yeah?
Self-defense.
Self-defense, yeah, great. So classic argument for terrorism and self-defense is one of the very few rights which we actually seem to think, or at least one of the few rights we think is arguably absolute. Exactly how you make it about anger, make it about self-defense, we can talk about it a bit later on. You might want to think about retribution. There is an argument that when agents of the state are committing war crimes, they forfeit their ability to lay claim to rights. There's a very specific argument you can use to make that claim. We will come on to that in a bit. When they're very obvious or unavoidable trade-offs. Now, when they're very obvious or unavoidable trade-offs in a debate, very often you can just use other methods of weighing, right? We all know what 7 methods of weighing are. There are only 7 ways of weighing an argument. I'm not sure if I can remember them. The 7 methods are time. Our argument has greater consequences in the long run. Quantity, our argument affects a greater number of people. Intensity, our argument affects the people who are affected the most. Then there is our argument is the most certain. Our argument grants the most unique benefits. Our argument helps specific groups of people with special obligations too. And our argument respects fundamental rights. So, our argument does not violate certain things which you should never violate. So those are the 7 standard ways of weighing arguments. So just as a random tip, this isn't what principles. Just write those 7 things down. In any debate, you'll find that there are at least 3 which apply to any argument you're making. Just do it as a checklist thing. It's actually fairly simple. And last one, extremely large speculative claims whose consequences are hard to pass. The reason why principles are useful in those sorts of debates is that when sometimes in opening, especially, both teams will get into a really hard to pass practical morass. Right? Both teams will be making 5 practical arguments, and there'll be 3 responses to each practical argument. It can be very hard to pick out exactly what you want to extend on, what the winning thing is. You might want to consider saying there's a simple principle argument which holds true no matter what the consequences are. That's different from saying the principle overrides the practical, but at least you have found something which will be true no matter what. Okay? So again, I'm not actually telling you what these principle arguments are, just telling you when you should think about using them. Okay? So you don't just whip them out whenever you can. What do you use principle arguments for? There are only really 2 things. There are only 2 things you can ever use a principle argument for. And outside of these 2 categories, principle arguments have no function in VP debating as it's done today. Okay? The first function of a principle argument is to show that we care more about one group than another. So very standard in all criminal justice debates, standard clashes, implicitly, often in what you're saying, do we care more about victims of crime? Do we care more about criminals? Or do we care more about society writ large? I'm sure all of you know how criminal justice debates go. There's a very standard interaction, right? Where one side goes, we need to care about victims the most because the state owes them a special obligation because the state has failed them. And they're the ones who have actually suffered the most. So on the basis of the 2 weighing metrics of intensity and special obligations, they are the paramount concern in this debate. And the other side does the standard left-wing thing, which is to say, but you forget that the criminals are also victims of the state, because they're victims of structural state failure over long periods of time. So we also claim a special obligation on part of criminals, and we also claim they're especially vulnerable because they're politically unpopular and so treated very badly. And then the other side says, well, we think that actual victims of criminals are even more a victim than criminals themselves, because they come from the same oppressed communities, and the state obligation to protect them from violence is more fundamental and more direct than a broad state obligation to ensure there's good education and economic opportunity. That is a very standard back and forth in every criminal justice debate. And usually the team which wins is a team which either takes that chain one step further, or the team which loses is just a team which forgets there's a standard response to the other side on it. So you should try and familiarize yourself with all of these very standard dynamics in debates about criminal justice. For instance, and then the second thing you use principle arguments for is proving an absolute. Usually it's proving that something is always impermissible. Now, there's a reason why there's a 3rd bullet point on that screen, in that I'm not being totally honest when I say there's only 2 functions of criminal justice argument. There's a 3rd, which is really a variant in the 2nd, which is that you use it to show, in effect, that there should be a multiplier for the effects for certain groups of people. So, if you look at the sub-bullet points, it's basically what it says there. So, in other words, you say that, suppose the debate is about torturing terrorists, or, surveilling low-income neighborhoods very intensively, or something along these lines. suppose you manage to prove that you make an argument that privacy is a really fundamental. Maybe you even go as far as saying privacy is like an absolute right, which I think is very hard to prove, but suppose you say something along those lines. What you can say at the end of doing that is that you can say, Judge, maybe at this point you believe that there is an absolute right that's being violated here, in which case it does not matter what the benefits are on the other side, we win. But even if you don't believe that my argument proves it is an absolute right, at the very least you should believe that it is an incredibly important consideration to people, and that the harms to this incredibly important thing are certain. And so to win over this principle, you can't just show marginal or uncertain benefits. You need something which is certain and overwhelming. So what you're doing is that you're raising the threshold of the practical good the other side needs to prove for them to be able to win a debate. So I would say this is a fairly good standard thing you can say at the end of a lot of the more absolute principle arguments you're trying to run. Because even if your principle is not absolute, it might still do a lot of legwork in helping to make your lower your argumentative burden in a debate. All right, all clear so far? Okay, cool. If I'm going too fast, yell at me, say something. All right, how to prove a principle? Basically, there are, again, 2.5 methods. The last method's kind of cheap, but it's a fun cheat, you know, and debate permits cheating, of a strictly logical sense, of course. The first way is fairly rare, it's quite difficult. You make an abstract argument from moral principles which hopefully everyone in the room can agree on. It's very difficult to do. I would say this is the kind of argument which usually, if you try and make up on the spot, you will screw it up. Which is why I think these are the sort of arguments it's good for you to kind of practice in your free time on internal spars and then bring them to big tournaments as it were fully formed. The second method is essentially intuition puns. Right? You use a thought experiment, illustration, real-world example to show that a principle exists. But it is absolutely critical, and this is where I think 80% of principles fail. It's critical to ensure that your thought experiment actually has an outcome the other side can't disagree with. Right? The other side needs to say, okay, we accept that in this scenario we would do the same thing you would do. The other side says, yeah, of course we would totally torture the person or harvest the organs or whatever. Well, then you're not doing a huge amount of work, right? You need to be able to respond to that kind of a response by saying, okay, maybe your case is consistent, but you have bought the moral consistency of your case at the cost of moral insanity, because you are mad if you seriously think this is how the moral universe works, right? You need to be able to force them into that situation. And the second thing you need to ensure is that the best explanation of the thought experiment is the precise principle you endorse. Very often, multiple principles can explain the same thought experiment. And it might not be the principle you're endorsing. Very often, thought experiments can also be justified by reference to utilitarian principles. So just make sure it's not easy for the other side to do either of those things. I cannot stress this enough. This is where really lots of arguments fail. There is an impression, I will say, among lots of people that principal arguments are just words. In a way, it's true because you need to have good control of language. But principal arguments are arguments like everything else. They've got premises, they've got conclusions, and much more so than for practical arguments, principal arguments need to be tight and rigorous. So I really want to stress that you need to be rigorous in the way you go about analyzing principles. The last tactic is foot jamming. So it's basically a variant number 2. So essentially what you do, and this is useful in closing, is that you use a POI usually to make the other side concede that there is some non-consequentialist element of the debate. That at least some part of this debate is not purely about consequences or maximizing utility. And then your next speaker can go out and say, okay, Judge, everyone in this debate seems to agree that there is more to this debate than just consequences. I'm going to tell you what that more is. Right? And you only need to get the other side to make the tiniest possible concession for this tactic to be able to work. And the reason why this tactic is super effective is that you don't actually need to prove the principle from the ground up yourself. Because if the other side agrees that there is a principle consideration, you can just come out and say, okay, so we do agree that there's more to this debate than just consequences. Now, you still do have to explain the principle, but you do not get to worry so much about the other side saying, we don't think this principle consideration exists at all. So the example I gave there is from the WSDC final, just because it was a very frustrating experience for me, okay? It really hurt me. The motion was, as you can see, this house prefers a world ruled by benevolent AI programmed to maximize, like, look at the motion. The motion says maximize utility by calculating the actions most guaranteed to reduce the greatest global suffering. So, what does the prop say? The prop I mean, the prop does not need 2 brain cells to run a debate-winning case, right? The prop says, well, on a fairly trivial level, we solve global poverty, we end climate change, we end misogyny, we end racism, and we end global conflict. I'm going to claim, Judge, that these are large debate-winning impacts. What do you do on op, right? The prop gets to say this stuff almost by fear. They need to pretend to make arguments, but the motion basically says you are going to make the world into some kind of utopia. So the burden on the op here really, so this was a debate I was watching live in the audience and getting very frustrated. Because the prop got away with being the good team, solving problems in the world. When actually, if you think about it, the opposition just needed to give one of 6 or 7 different POIs to the other side to make the prop look like the creepy, weird side, right? And I'm sure all of you can think of some of these POIs which you could give on the op to the prop. Anyone want to suggest some POIs you might want to give? What POIs might you give if you're on opposition? The other side has just claimed they end racism, global poverty, war, climate change, misogyny. And you are sitting there. What do you say? Yeah.
That AI and human existence.
Well, and human existence along the correct lines. But you see, you are going a bit too far. In other words, you are overshooting the mark. And so it's possible for the other side to say, no, of course we wouldn't, because we think there are ways to make human existence joyful and lovely, as opposed to horrible and immiserated the way it is right now. But you're definitely thinking along the correct lines. Along those lines, yeah.
Replace people with computers, maybe?
So again, correct lines. But you see, you are going for like fairly far hypotheticals. Go for something really common sense and grounded and realistic. The other side would actually go, okay, that weird. Yes.
Let's force everyone to give their money to everyone so that we have equal money.
Okay, closer, except that for a surprisingly large class of left-wing judges, the notion of global equality would be tolerable as an outcome. I know, shock horror. But we're getting close. I still see that yet.
Do people like to govern themselves?
Okay, that's a very good one, because it points to one of the problems about this. So think about it, it is a dictatorship. So 2 of the standard arguments for democracy, the state power principle and the incommensurability principle, actually do come to bear directly. So correct. I was actually hoping it'd point to another principle, like a more non-consequentialist principle. I'll come to you in a moment. I think there was someone there who I haven't... No? Yes?
Is a diamond equally valuable to 2 people?
Okay. But see, two out there. Give me something less out there, yeah.
Is this AI just watching you in your bedroom, in your home?
Okay, potentially a privacy argument as well. But see, all of you are asking POIs, all these large numbers, where the other side could finagle their way out of it, yeah.
Is it okay to kill people who are working on an oil plant
Yeah.
if this would create like change that is good in the future for like...
Okay, yes, I think very close, but that sounds like a very specific hypothetical. So, you see how this tactic, although it's easy in practice, it's not easy in theory. Often when it comes to thinking of specific POIs, it's not always that easy, especially in 15 minutes. A couple of things which I was... so Harish, I was sitting beside Harish, and we got so frustrated, we just started texting each other like, I will ask this POI, so I've got an even better one. So a very simple one might be, would you go along with the AI's recommendation if it figures out that the easiest way to eliminate the suffering caused by global poverty is to allow the bottom billion to starve to death? Would you go along with it? Question number 1. Question number 2 could be, if it decides the best way to achieve no crime at all is to publicly torture and execute people guilty of all crimes, of even a slightly violent nature, would you go along with it? If there's an outbreak of a new virus at a hospital, and to avoid the possibility of a global pandemic, the AI decides to lock the doors and allow everyone in there to die, would you go along with it? Right? And to each of these, there really is only one response. The response there's 3 maybe. Response number 1 is to say, but the global AI, this AI would never say that. To which the response is, are you absolutely sure that the AI will not say that? Because we can be absolutely sure a human being will not say that, because a human being has moral blinkers on. A human being takes into account certain very basic moral rules about what is and is not permissible. But you just told me this AI doesn't, and that is its great strength. Are you absolutely sure, proposition, when you tell me the AI will not recommend this, that you're not just lying? That's the response. That's the first response you could give. The second response they could give is that, oh yes, if the AI says that, we would follow. In which case you say, well, okay, you've then agreed this AI is morally monstrous. Right? Or they say, yes, we'll go along with what the AI does. In which case you say, well, congratulations, you have bought the principal consistency of the case at the cost of proving you are a monster, and this is why you're going to lose this by a country mile. Right? And that's a great example of how you can use that kind of a tactic. But I think you do need to spend some time coming up with those sorts of POIs. Now, for this particular debate, the reason why I'm saying don't ask weird hypothetical POIs, but ask POIs based on things which might actually be done in the real world, is because you want to make it difficult for the other side to worm out of it. If your POIs are too speculative, the other side can say, well, that's not going to happen, or they could try and poo-poo it otherwise. So try and make it something which is really tailored to the specific thing you're trying to prove in this debate. Okay, cool. Remember, the principal argument is only worth making if the other side has to disagree with it. This is a very important test. Must the other side disagree with this principle? If they can agree with the principle and just run a case, which is about how to achieve it, then you're wasting your time. Right? Is it strategic to spend 4 minutes proving a right to housing in a motion this House to nationalize all housing? No, it's not. Because everyone's going to agree that housing is a fundamental right. The question is just how to achieve it. Okay, let's do a variant on this, which maybe it's a bit more tricky. Universal basic income. This House supports. This House will implement a universal basic income. I'm assuming all of us know what UBI is. What's the most important argument for prop in favor of UBI? Anyone? Volunteers? UBI, universal basic income? Because most proposition teams run an argument, the first argument, which leads straight to a very trivial loss. Although it's the most obvious argument, yeah.
Like, theoretical welfare is bad, but UBI did because of the logistics and how it's
Yeah, so there's a very good practical argument about how people fall through the cracks in welfare systems because testing is expensive and inefficient. Maybe governments are malicious, maybe governments are incompetent, or people don't want to apply. That's a good practical argument. Yeah, that would be a good argument, but it shouldn't be your first argument, I would say. But it's a perfectly good argument. If you run it strongly, it certainly is debate winning. Anyone else?
When you do welfare, you aggregate preferences for people themselves, but if you give them money, they can determine what is utile to them.
Okay, good. That is one layer of the most important argument. But you are bang on in the specific sense, yeah. Like you have one of the most important bits of the most important argument. Yeah.
Everybody has a right to life and liberty without working.
Yeah. Yeah, that is the most important argument, isn't it? Like, most teams who try to see on proposition, when they get UBI, they talk about how it's important to help the poor. If you make an argument about why it's important to help the poor, you lose the debate. Because what's the obvious alternative to UBI? We have this thing called the welfare system, which does this special thing called help the poor. The only difference between UBI and a robust Nordic-style welfare system is, yes, that you have testing, which could be difficult and flawed, but the other difference is that you are giving a universal income to rich people as well. So the real difference between both sides is why do rich people, or well-to-do people, or economically comfortable people deserve an income too? You're not the left-wing side in this debate. At least not at this point. You might become the left-wing side of the debate later on, but you don't start off the debate as a left-wing side. You start off the debate as the side arguing that income is a fundamental right. And one of the reasons why income is a fundamental right, as opposed to, let's say, entitlement to goods and services in kind, is precisely because of what you said, that you cannot have a minimal degree of agency over life if you cannot choose what to spend your income on. And then you need to make a moral distinction, so that there's a distinction between what people need and what people deserve. And oh God, sounds like Christopher Nolan, doesn't it? Sorry, I hate his films. But there is a distinction. There are people who don't need a universal income, but are entitled to one nonetheless, simply because of their status as a free and equal human being. Right? And there are many ways you can go about arguing this, but can anyone think of rights to which people are entitled in society, even when they don't actually need them? Are there any parallels? Yeah?
So you would say, like, for the same reason for which in countries with public health care, billionaires are still allowed to enter public hospitals even though they may not need it, they could afford like private health care which might be better, they wouldn't be refused entrance in a public hospital. Okay.
Yeah, very good. One example is universal public health care. Why are rich people allowed to access it as well? Now, the reason why I say that wouldn't be the best possible analogy, because it's not universal, right? Not every country has universal healthcare. The other side could say, well, yeah, we think that's a dumb system. We think rich people should be forced to subsidize the rest of the system. Yeah.
Privacy?
Privacy, yeah.
I may not have anything to hide, but that doesn't mean that state has the right to see what I'm doing.
Potentially, except states very often do violate privacy. So this doesn't seem that absolute. Yeah.
Maybe something like the right to life, like having bodyguards living in a secluded
rich, they can protect themselves most of the time. They don't need the police, but nevertheless, you need to protect them.
Yeah, so I think that's more promising. So maybe something along the lines of how, if you think about it, there is no reason why rich people should be allowed to call the police or the firefighters. They should be made to pay for that stuff, right? We still nonetheless think they're entitled to it by right because they're citizens, and this is something which is universal. I think another thing I want to think about is like kind of the right to vote. I am pretty sure reasonably rich people have enough influence over electoral processes, either singly or as groups, that it wouldn't really make a huge difference if they weren't allowed to vote. Or at least some of them weren't allowed to vote. We nonetheless still give it to them. Well, I'm not sure why someone who can literally buy out half the political system should be given a vote, but we still think they deserve it. And so I'm not saying this is the full argument, but thinking along these lines will get you to a point where you might start to see the notion of universal income as fundamental, right? You can even say cheeky things. Like, think about it, poor people don't pay tax, they're entitled to welfare. Well, rich people who do pay tax, why shouldn't they be entitled to welfare as well? You can do like some of these tricky little syllogisms if you like to. Okay, some key guidelines. Oh, sorry, this last thing, very important. Principal arguments have a factual component. Because principles need to latch onto certain facts about the world, right? Like if you say, this is slavery, and slavery is absolutely prohibited, you actually need to prove something is slavery. And that means making a practical argument. Or at least characterizing something in a way, calling something slavery, is plausible. So everyone forgets this, actually. Principal arguments are always half practical, because principles apply to a set of facts. If you don't prove those facts, or you don't characterize the facts in such a way that the principle is triggered, you are wasting your time. Alright? So don't forget that. I know this sounds super basic, but I guarantee you just look at people trying to make principles and you're like, yep, they didn't do this, they didn't do this. So just bear these things in mind. Alright, couple key guidelines, very important. There's nothing much to really say about these things because they're not that complicated, but I want to put them out there. Language matters a lot. I'm just giving some examples of standard phrases which people in the past have used and found effective. I will say this is a very personal thing. I tend to use slightly more formal language. Some people tend to be much more emotive. You don't have to use language which is terribly fancy, right? I mean, we all know this, actually. I shouldn't be telling people this in Eastern Europe of all places. But language does not have to be fancy to be very compelling and funny, right? Examples and illustrations matter a lot. We've talked about this already. You cannot be formulaic or mechanical. I really want to stress this. I have seen people think about principles as if they are just plug and play. Right? Oh, I've learned this principle, so I will just recite what I learned word for word, and that means I've proven a principle. That's wrong. It's very good that you know the standard formula, but you need to do a lot of work to tailor your principle to the specific thing the debate is about. And last of all, you need to sound like you believe what you're arguing. I'm not saying you need to be emotive or excited. You can be a very calm technical speaker, but you must sound like you believe what you're saying. I will say there are certain principles, usually involving absolute rights, which require you to sound a bit pissed off when you're saying them. Because absolute rights have a certain quality of let the world burn. And you can't, I think it's hard to, in a very calm way, say, I want the world to burn and I don't care. You usually have to be at least a bit rhetorical or a bit angry for those things to work. Alright, can't be run casually. People often try and run principles as like a layer of an argument. It can work. But usually, if you're only spending 30 seconds on a principle, unless it's a very standard thing, like we owe reparative duties to victims, you will usually need to spend 2 or 3 arguments to really make the principle work. Part of it is just judge psychology, right? If you spend 2 to 3 minutes on something, everyone is forced to take it seriously, and then the debate becomes principle. And then when the debate becomes principle, what happens when the judges sit down and discuss? They say, yes, so I thought this was a principled debate primarily. And once judges have told themselves this is a principled debate, suddenly they are very open to talking about principles. But if you only spend 30 seconds on it, it might not become a principled debate. Okay, I've already talked about the second sub-bullet point. You've got to run them correctly. That's how the principle works very often is debate winning. I see people here from a particular World School semi-final in which there was that frustration. Because as I recall, the Greek team did not run, or did not manage to prove non-consequentialism, whereas the Bulgarian team basically said, we don't mind chopping people's legs off if it means we create slightly more utility in society. And the Greeks were very persuasively angry about it, but they didn't actually quite get around to making the syllogism for why non-consequentialism is correct. So I was part of the unanimous panel which gave it against them. I'm so sorry, guys. And I know at least some people had seen the YouTube lecture, but no one had actually run any of the arguments. It really annoyed me. Sorry, that's fine. It didn't feature into the discussion. Sorry for those of you who weren't at law schools, this is very alienating and jokey, and I must apologize. You will be terrible at them the first few times. Again, this is not super helpful to tell you right before the World Championship. But I like to think at least some of you will be back for multiple World Championships. And also, you might find yourself in a debate where you really have to run a principle, in which case you need sort of argumentative self-rescue, right? And then you just have to do it. Be creative. So don't be afraid of changing principles up and attaching principles in ways which might not be that orthodox. And also remember there are many ways of formulating the same basic principle. We will encounter this in the next couple of decks we go through in a lot more detail. Okay? Oh, we're actually making quite a good pace. Excellent. We might cover 70% of what I was hoping to go through. Okay, yeah, I don't need to give you all examples. We will encounter them at some point. Okay, cool. So, now that's this first piano concerto. Excellent work for those of you who are into cyclic form. Okay, we go to the second thing. So we kind of have to talk about escaping utilitarianism because this kind of is the foundation for all of the other principal arguments. All arguments about special obligations, about criminal justice, not so much about choice, which is its own kind of freestanding thing, although I suppose it's in some sense deontological, relate to underlying arguments about whether we care about consequences or other things in the moral universe. So I'm just going to go through this. Now, if you've seen the earlier lecture, which I did, this covers similar content, essentially in a lot more detail. All right? And again, some of this stuff can be a bit abstract. If I'm going too fast, please shout at me. I'm happy to slow down and explain stuff again. I will also give a bit of a content warning here. We will be discussing fairly difficult and what for some people can be traumatizing or triggering issues. So war crimes, sex crimes, these things will feature in this section because for better or for worse, when you're discussing big moral ideas, often these big moral ideas, these fundamental ideas of what right and wrong is, they kind of make themselves felt through atrocity. Okay, so just letting you know before we actually jump into that stuff. Okay, what we'll cover, why utilitarianism is dominant, just fairly quickly on that one. Justifying utilitarianism, which I do actually want to spend a fair bit of time on, because very often you will implicitly argue for utilitarianism without actually saying the word utilitarianism. And then how do you escape utilitarianism? There's 4 standard ways. You should just know this stuff, and that will make your life easier in a bunch of debates. Okay, just to quickly give you a sense of what kind of debates tend to implicate utilitarianism. So these are like standard debates, which are about utilitarianism versus something else, right? So torturing terrorists, obviously. Okay, good. No one looks puzzled by that. Allowing people to sell themselves into slavery, legitimate to target religious sites in war. The fourth one was, I think, Thailand semifinals. And there's actually some pretty good speeches on the opposition, arguing that there is more to human life than just caring about happiness. So things like obligations, or agency, or duty. So I encourage you to look at that debate, or debates for animal rights. We all know utilitarianism is typically taken as an argument as a moral system which favors animal rights, yeah? Because it doesn't distinguish between whether or not you're an animal or human, so long as you can suffer or feel pleasure. According to most schools of utilitarianism, I should clarify, you should care about them. And these are implied challenges to utilitarianism. Is it obvious to everyone how these debates actually implicate utilitarianism versus something else? I just want to look through them and actually take a moment to think about how one side is utilitarianism and another side is something else. Okay? We all know how reparations debates fit into this, right? Is anyone not clear about how reparations debates? Maybe I should actually say something about it. The side arguing for reparations in debating is never the utilitarian side. Because if your argument is historical atrocities cause people to suffer in the present, we need to alleviate suffering in the present, therefore we need reparations, your argument fails to the obvious counterprop, which is, why don't we just help everyone who is suffering? Right? I mean, there are some descendants of slaves who are rich. So the only difference between both sides is that you are paying reparations to rich descendants of slaves, we are just giving money to everyone who deserves it. And to the extent we're helping people who have suffered because of historical injustice, we don't care about the causality of the injustice, we only care about the fact of that suffering. Right? So implicitly, the side arguing for reparations is arguing for special obligations to certain groups. And if you think about it, that is how you can use the logic of utilitarianism to challenge them. We'll come on to that in a moment, okay? Alright, so just very quickly, why is it dominant? Well, basically it turns morality into numbers, right? And the time, intensity, quantity, and certainty comparatives, out of the 7 we just talked about, 4 of them are actually the straightforward applications of utilitarianism in one guise or another. So if you have the debate on the utilitarian basis, you can actually make a lot of fairly sophisticated mechanistic arguments and do quite a lot of fairly sophisticated weighing as well. And obviously very often everyone agrees on what the relevant moral outcome is in the debate, so you don't need to worry very much about the fact that you might be endorsing utilitarian precepts. Okay? Alright, justifying utilitarianism, 2-part argument. Those of you who are very philosophically oriented will immediately recognize that there are more premises in utilitarianism than these two. For the purposes of debating, these are the only 2 you need to prove. You prove that happiness, or preference satisfaction, whatever you call it, is what matters. And second, you prove that everyone's happiness matters equally. Okay? So, let's talk about how you might want to demonstrate each of these 2 premises. So number 1, premise 1. How do you show that happiness is what matters? Step 1, and again, those of you who are philosophically minded will notice that what that first bullet point is doing is kind of conveniently jumping over the is-or gap. Okay, it's actually implying a certain kind of moral realism. I'll try to avoid going into meta-ethics as much as possible. Meta-ethics is the study of what ethics is or where it comes from. Unfortunately, most ethical arguments actually imply a certain meta-ethical stance, and this is where you actually brush up against meta-ethics a bit. But essentially, step 1 is you say, what is valuable must be linked to what human beings ultimately value. Step 2 is you say, well, if you actually look around you, all humans value, at a sufficiently high level of abstraction, the same thing. They all want to have their preferences fulfilled. It's in the definition of a preference that you would like to have it fulfilled. You can look at those 2 philosophers. They have different formulations of it. Most people don't buy J.S. Mill's formulation. A bunch of people do buy Sidgwick's formulation. You don't have to worry about that too much in a debate. And then what you say is, okay, if all human beings ultimately want the same thing, which is to have their preferences fulfilled, then surely what is of value is just preference satisfaction. And we can call the feeling of preference satisfaction happiness, or eudaimonia, or whatever you want to call it, right? So that's the simplest argument for why happiness is what's valuable. Simply because we can't conceive of something outside of happiness / preference satisfaction. They're not technically the same thing, but don't worry about that too much. And because we can't imagine anything outside of it, that's all there is. Now, the good thing about this argument is it's actually an appeal to simplicity, right? Other moral systems might have to say, well, certain preferences are legitimate, and certain preferences are not legitimate. So a preference to gain pleasure by maiming and hurting an innocent person, that's not a valid preference. A utilitarian doesn't like that, because a utilitarian will say, well, where are you getting this from? What lets you say this preference is invalid? A utilitarian says, well, let's just take all preferences as valid, because that's the only thing people seem to value. And then, in practical terms, maximizing preference satisfaction might mean actually preventing some people from fulfilling their preferences. Because if I let you act on your preference to maim and murder and kill, well, then you're overriding other people's preferences, right? But there's nothing inherent about that preference which is bad. So a utilitarian would say. Premise 2, everyone matters equally. It's a very great argument to use because it actually accords with a lot of standard liberal intuitions you have. There are, again, 3.5 ways of kind of proving this. This, by the way, has always been one of the strongest points of utilitarianism. It's sort of universal aspect. The first argument is just appeal to liberal intuition. All human beings are fundamentally equal. The moment you start saying some people matter more than others in a fundamental sense, you start venturing, arguably, into fairly dangerous turf. Right? So in response to someone saying, let's say the debate is, this house believes that colonizer countries should pay reparations to countries they've colonized. Right? What, if you really want to reclaim the moral high ground from them with opening opposition, what do you say? You say, Judge, the team on proposition believes that there is a way to rank sufferings. They're willing to look at a starving person in a country we haven't colonized and say, your pain just doesn't matter as much as someone who might be better off in a country we have colonized. Because somehow the unchanging fact of the history of the world demands that your suffering just matter less. We're going to go for a much simpler moral premise. We're just going to tell you that every human life matters equally, suffering wherever it exists and for whatever reason should be eliminated, and that's why we prefer a system of distributing aid based on need and what is effective, rather than what should go to former colonized countries, right? And implicitly what you're doing, without ever saying we support utilitarianism, is that you are appealing to liberal intuition in argument number one, the notion that all suffering matters equally, right? Because all human beings are fundamentally equal. The second argument is an appeal to arbitrariness. What you do is that you say, look, it's random that you have your preferences and I have mine, right? These preferences are a result of where we're born, how we were raised, the specific things we happen to encounter in our life, maybe even our genes. And so given it's arbitrary that you have your preferences and I have mine, why should my preferences have special claim to what I care about over yours? If all preferences are arbitrary, then surely I should treat all preferences in the universe the same. And so I should try and maximize preferences globally. And global preference maximization turns out to just be utilitarianism. Right? So if the rational attitude I should take towards my preferences is the same rational attitude I should take towards all preferences, you get utilitarianism. The third argument, you wouldn't really use this in a debate, so don't worry too much about it. There is a very nice argument from Derek Parfit who argues, basically he says that personal identity is not a really important moral concept. It's a fairly complicated argument involving things like overlapping chains of identity and everything. Essentially what he says is that you are not really you. Your sense that you are, like Ashish is not like some transcendent moral entity. And that what makes me and you is actually fairly fragile and changeable. So if your sense of individual self is an illusion, then it doesn't make any sense that I pursue my interests over yours in a robust sense. I'm just going to give you this very nice quote from Derek Parfit's book, Reasons and Persons. Many people think it's the greatest book of analytical philosophy written in the 20th century. That is obviously very debatable, but I encourage you to buy and read it nonetheless. It's pretty good. It's pretty dense, but it's pretty good. And so this is kind of like a brief primer as to what some of his views are. When I changed my views, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There is still a difference between my life and the lives of other people. Because he does claim there is such a thing as personal identity, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. I am less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. Okay? So I don't want to go into this in a lot of depth because it is a fairly complicated argument. And last one, just sort of an appeal to empathy. Right? So lots of religions have some variant of the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you think about it, you can't apply this rule in a literal sense, right? You can't be like, well, I like eating vanilla ice cream, so I should give you vanilla ice cream. That's obviously a mad way to apply the golden rule. But if you think about it, the only sensible way to apply the golden rule is to say, well, what I fundamentally want is to have my preferences fulfilled. So what I should also do is to try and fulfill your preferences. And that again gets you to utilitarianism. Similarly, what it means to love thy neighbor as thyself, if you think about it, what does it mean to love yourself? What does it mean for you to care about yourself? Now, one account of why you care about yourself, for you to love yourself, is that you treat your purposes and your ends and your goals as governing in your life. That you ought to shape your life around pursuing these things. Now, if you shape your life around pursuing what you find valuable, then you love yourself. What does it mean to obey the religious command, to love other people as you love yourself? Is that you treat the governing goals of their lives just as you treat the governing goals of your life. Same thing. Okay? So, the last bullet point just makes it clear. Okay, is it all fairly straightforward? Okay, cool. Good. Alternative tactic, which is very useful in debates, is to go on the attack. If one side accuses you of doing something very creepy and weird, you can say, well, you're doing creepy and weird things too, because by failing to take actions to save lives, no matter how odd or unnerving these actions may be, you are also murdering. You're just murdering by omission. And if everyone is murdering, then the only question is, who murders less? So there's two ways of doing it. Those are the two sub-bullet points. One is to make an argument from agency. To say, if you know that a failure to act will lead to X, and B, you fail to act, and C, X happens as a result, then you are still responsible for X, because your agency was just as involved in an outcome as if you had acted. The second way to go about it, this is more of an intuition problem, is to say that acts of mission distinction is purely linguistic, right? If I crash my car into a toddler, that is an act. If I fail to press the brake pedal in time, that is an omission. Does anything of moral significance hang on how you describe my action? no it doesn't, you killed someone, you're responsible for it. Okay, and there's some nice rhetoric available for it. You can say something, again, to take the stereotypical torture terrorist debate, right? You can say, oh, this opposition accuses us of murder. That is true, but they are murdering people too. They just get to bask in the warm, delusional glow of doing it by omission. Right? Both sides have their hands dipped in blood in this debate. No one's getting away scot-free. The only question is who does this murder less. I've also heard someone in the debate quite persuasively, quite rhetorically, make the claim that death is the currency of government. There is nothing a government can't do, which is not murder in some way or another. If you build a hospital here instead of there are people who are going to die in that area as opposed to in another area. If you spend your money on a sports stadium as opposed to healthcare, some people are going to die as a result. All government is about deciding who lives and dies in what quantities. And to say that you're not allowed to murder, or that there is some absolute rule against treating lives in this utilitarian sense, actually just paralyzes government and the concept of government as a whole. Right? So these are just some examples of things which I've heard people say, which I thought were fairly effective. Again, it's a very personal thing. You've got to choose your own wording. Right? Okay, we don't necessarily have time to go through it, but I mean, let's look at the mandatory moral enhancement drugs thing. I know I've put their bracket prop. What is the obvious argument about taking more opposition up to taking more enhancement drugs? These drugs make you more caring, more empathetic, more cooperative. Why should we not coerce people into taking them? What should spring to mind? Yeah?
It might make marginalized groups more willing to accept their oppression because they're cooperative.
Yeah, and in fact, I'll go a bit further. I would say you're kind of rigging morality, right? Because everyone who takes this will be convinced that taking it was a good idea to begin with. Because one consequence of becoming more empathetic is that you agree with the fact you became more empathetic. So, in a way, this is a decision you have no capacity to regret, because your whole evaluation function has been rigged. Actually, what you're saying does actually link to a basic comparison I was hoping someone would be able to make. What is this most like? Yeah.
I was going to say moral constructivism is something
Yeah.
that's here now. Like there's no moral, real morality. It's
Yeah.
constructed through how individuals.
Yes, potentially. I think there's actually constructivist arguments on both sides, but I want something simpler, where you don't even need to say constructivism. No, what is this like? Something must creep you out of forcing people to take drugs which change their moral calculus.
You're murdering someone, replacing them with a new person.
Okay, good. Say this is very much like murder, because you could say your fundamental views of what you are constitutive of who you are. So this is kind of like killing people and replacing them with some kind of weird doppelganger. Yeah. There's another analogy actually along these lines. Yeah.
I was thinking on brainwashing someone for some goals.
Yes, but this is obviously brainwashing. They're just saying brainwashing is great, but what is brainwashing like?
I think I watched a similar debate where someone said, you can't consent to this because it's like a new person. It's like, I can't consent.
Yeah, so actually the murder argument, if you think about it, is another way to get to the same argument which you mentioned. Right? The notion that you are rigging a person. So not only are you changing someone fundamentally, you're changing them fundamentally in a way which you do not even have the capacity to ever regret. Because having taken the drug will tell you it was a good decision. But what does this sound like?
It's addiction.
Yes, addiction. Very specifically, what is it? Push it even slightly further. Beyond addiction, addiction is okay.
Slavery.
Yes, slavery. Yes, it's slavery. It's slavery because, in fact, if you think about it, this is worse, isn't it? Because at least someone who is enslaved still has a mind of their own. They can still hate what is being done to them. You have enslaved someone so profoundly, you have attacked the fundament of what they are so profoundly, you have removed their capacity to object. You're treating them as objects, right? So I think, if you think in these terms, what should really leap out at you, that coercing someone to change their moral view is not only slavery, it is significantly worse, or at least there's a very strong claim to be made that this is significantly worse than slavery. And some of the things which we've discussed can actually fit into the characterization as well. As I said, there are many different principles you can use in a debate like this. It's all about how you fit your intuitions into that framework. So what would you say on proposition? I want you to go on the attack. How would you say that this choice thing doesn't really matter? Yeah?
I think you could argue that people fundamentally do not have a right to act immorally.
Okay, yes, you could take a fairly skeptical position about moral realism. But that's very advanced. I like that. I would do that for fun, but a bit risky, yeah.
The universe is inherently deterministic, thus it doesn't matter.
Okay. So in this case, you would reach for the everything is inherently deterministic thing. Could work. I think this is one of the ways where it could work. I think it's still a bit risky, but I think it could work. Yeah.
Something is only moral if we can choose to not be moral.
Okay. And how would that plug into the proposition's case? You would tell the other side, so overriding people's choice in this way is okay because?
So for government, like the implicit government metric is maximizing morality, but then they have to show that doing this is a moral thing to do, forcing people to be moral. Otherwise, they knife themselves.
Yeah. Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes, fair enough, but it's still a bit too indirect. Yeah, just behind.
We make decisions for people all of the time, which we know makes them happier in the long run. So if they're happier in the long run, we feel okay making that decision.
Potentially. I would say that runs into the problem that the other side says this is a form of coercion so extreme and fundamental that, for instance, yes, it's true. We have laws preventing you from hurting someone else, right? Or driving above the speed limit. But those seem to be much less fundamental incursions on your liberty than this particular thing. Yeah.
I think Propkin claimed that morality is arbitrary and oftentimes socially constructed anyway.
Yeah.
And that this is just an extension of that.
Okay, yeah, good. So I would think actually that's one of the lower hanging ways of defeating the choice argument. Say, well, you're assuming that in the absence of this government coercion, we will be free to choose what we believe in the first place. Whereas we're indoctrinated from the moment we enter the world by social forces, by religion. If you're left-wing, you can say the word capitalism as if it's a dirty word. I am left-wing, so I shouldn't be so coy about it. You can say capitalism. You're indoctrinated into being, selfish, consumerist, materialist, so on and so forth. And if you think about it, you can push this further, right? You can actually frame this moral enhancement drug as undoing coercive forces which already act on us, right? So, I don't know, let me think. Maybe you could say something like, the great problem in our moral reasoning in contemporary societies is that we have been manipulated by all kinds of social forces into not taking the existence of other people seriously. That each one of us, as we live our daily lives, despite our claims to be left-wing and empathetic, really are acting as if other people, in a morally relevant sense, do not exist. And it is this single moral flaw which has led to catastrophic failures of governance, which has led to all kinds of terrible things in society. We stand to correct that. Right? And then if you frame it that way, then the coercion argument becomes less important. I would say, instead of, if you want to run arguments along the lines of free choices don't exist, one thing you could think of is there any sense in which we can actually choose our moral beliefs? Because if you think about it, let's assume you could choose your moral beliefs. Say, I'm choosing my moral beliefs. Okay, if you are really choosing moral beliefs, then you must have criteria upon which to choose those moral beliefs, correct? Well, but if there are criteria based upon which you choose your moral beliefs, then surely your real moral preferences were just those criteria. Then the question becomes, okay, if those criteria were just your actual moral preferences, on what basis did you choose them? And eventually you realize that deep down, our preferences have to be at base unchosen, because you can't keep choosing infinitely, right? It can't be choice all the way down. At some point, we must just have things which we like, and then on that premise, we then decide what maximizes our preferences in some abstract sense. So you could make kind of an argument as well. But just to give you an illustration of how very often when you're on the utilitarian side, a big part of winning the debate from the utilitarian side is attacking the non-utilitarian side by showing the things or values which they purport to maximize don't actually exist in the real world, in either a conceptual sense or a practical sense. Okay? Alright, attacking utilitarianism, just remember these things. They'll be helpful. Okay, so 4 strategies. That's what's on the slides. Number 1, don't cheat. I'm basically going to talk about rural utilitarianism. Prove that trade-offs are impossible. Prove that trade-offs are impermissible. And then prove that utilitarianism is incomplete. So this is some of the stuff I talked about in the YouTube lecture, but this is a significantly more detailed version of that. Again, if I'm going too fast, yell at me, yeah? Alright, strategy 1, cheating. This is very easy to use and quite hard to come back to if you do it rigorously. But this is a very mechanistically sensitive argument I will point out, okay? So what you say is that when we are making decisions, especially decisions about what powerful entities should do, so this could be about corporations, it could be about governments, it could be about bodies like the UN, for instance, we shouldn't just act according to what generates the most utility. We should act according to the rules which in the long run generate the most utility. And the reason is, even if a particular action, like torturing a terrorist, might be utile, generate utility in that one instance, what happens when we permit it to be done in one instance where it is utile is that it will be done in the second, third, fourth, fifth instance where it is not utile. So the only way to prevent us from heading down this slippery slope of abuse is to have an absolute rule. But in order for this argument to work, you really need to show the slope is slippery. And so you need to give, I would say, my general rule to you is, if you're thinking about running this argument, please give me at least like 3 solid mechanisms. Okay, so there are a couple of standard tactics you can use whenever you're trying to show that the slope is slippery. Okay, so let's just go back to torturing terrorists. We're going to talk about it. What is a slippery slope from torturing terrorists to doing terrible, disutile things in the long run? Can anyone volunteer a couple of mechanisms? Yeah.
Because they are the most despicable people in society, it's very easy to torture them for the results. Thus, the state may assign other people to be tortured for X results.
Okay, yeah, good. You could say, well, states are fairly tribalistic. You might want to say more specifically, during times of moral panic, right, in the aftermath of a terrorist attack, where in the middle of a security scare, it is very common for the state to turn inwards towards unpopular groups and to scapegoat them. And one of the easiest things to do in that circumstance is, jail them without trial, hold them without detention. Look at Korematsu, look at what happened in the aftermath of 9/11 in the US. Look at extraordinary rendition, look at enhanced interrogation techniques, right? So it's very easy for the government to do this to other unpopular groups as well. Yeah, just to give you a couple of other mechanisms as well, legal precedent, right? The legal system is much more likely to approve of something, not only when it involves national security, because judges tend to be quite deferential, but the first time a government tries to justify this thing, the government will tell the judge, look, this is an extraordinary remedy, we've only done it once, it will never be done again, and we can guarantee that this information is absolutely crucial and will save a bunch of lives. But what will the government say the second time it comes before court?
They did it before.
Yeah, the government will say, look, Your Honor, this is, of course, this is an extreme act, but this is not unprecedented, and it's been done before, it has its social benefits. And when it comes to national security, the legal system is not well placed to second guess the evaluations of hardened security professionals in the government superstructure. Then the second time it happens. The third time the government comes before the court, what does it argue? It says, Judge, there is a track record of these things being done with success and of judges showing appropriate deference, right? So you can talk about legal precedent. You can talk about public normalization, right? We know from mere exposure effect that the more people are exposed to something, the more they find it normal or even end up liking it, so on and so forth, right? One very important thing I will say, a very common way of proving a slippery slope is like blur the boundaries of a concept. So if you're restricting racist or popular speech, you should immediately go, a big part of the case, if you're running this debate, or this case, is to go, what exactly is racist speech? Because it's not at all obvious, is it? If I say something like, we need to seriously reduce immigration because many immigrants fail to appropriately integrate, that's obviously not racist. That's appropriate. You might disagree with it, but it's appropriate. If I say, immigrants don't fit into our country, they don't appreciate our culture, I don't like them, is that racist? I wouldn't say so. Some people might say yes. What if someone says, these immigrants are filthy animals and they're here to destroy my culture and my way of life? Is that racist? Many would say yes. But substantively, is statement number 3 saying something fundamentally different from statement number 1? I would say no. I would say lots of rich people get to say racist things and not be prosecuted because they say it using nice language. And lots of working class people who express the exact same sentiments get punished or called out because they say things in language which to them feels more genuine. Or at least you should seriously consider making this argument in a debate. And then having made this observation, you might want to say, even if it does genuinely exist racist speech proposition, are you very comfortable giving the government the power to determine what is or is not racist speech? Given that the government can pick and choose which racist speech to go after. Of course, you people might go after all the right-wing racists, but what if the government, the next administration, goes after all the people saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free? Because they say, well, that's clearly a genocidal call for the elimination of all the Jews in Israel. Are you comfortable giving a government that kind of power? Right? So let's just have a rule saying we will not have any laws which punish people on the basis of whether or not their speech happens to be racist. Right? So this is a classic example of how to use a boundary pushing argument. Now this is not a principal argument, but it leads to, as it were, a principal outcome. It's an argument for an absolute rule. Okay? Does this make sense to everyone? So even those of you who hate principal arguments should be able to do this fairly comfortably. Yeah? It's just mechanisms. Alright, strategy number 2, trade-offs are impossible. This argument I haven't seen made that commonly. You usually only do it in a debate, which is very obviously about utilitarianism versus something else. Those of you who have watched my HWS 2024 final, we were opening up in some utilitarianism debate, so we did run this argument. But I haven't actually run this argument that often. Essentially, utilitarianism assumes you can add up happiness in some meaningful way. And this argument says it's unclear if that actually made sense. Many different ways of formulating this. If you want, you can just take a photo of it, because I find that this wording convenient, and you can just wheel it out. Obviously, you need to still make it specific to the debate, but this is a good starting point. There is no common social organism encountering all of our experiences at once. Happiness, or feelings in general, are attached to specific experiences in specific consciousnesses. So what does it mean to take, I don't know, Sajid's happiness at political change in Bangladesh, to take my happiness at really great sex, and add those two things together? Like, when I add those two things together, what is the thing which results? It's not obvious that those things could be abstracted out of our brains and added up in an abstract way like this. Can we sum up experiences across the boundaries of persons? Is another way I've heard it expressed, right? I just want to note that this method does not prove an alternative to utilitarianism. It is a powerful critique of utilitarianism, but you need to separately prove what the alternative is. Okay, just to give an idea of how this, again, for the sake of rigor, okay, because I care about you knowing things and not just winning debates. I'm broken like that. This is how Robert Nozick expresses the idea in, this book is like the Bible for libertarians. I don't think it's super well argued, but I do think it's written quite pretty. Right? There are only individual people with their own individual lives. Using one of these people for the benefit of others uses him and benefits the others, nothing more. Talk of an overall social good covers this up. To use a person in this way does not sufficiently respect and take into account the fact that he is a separate person, that his is the only life he has. He does not get some overbalancing good from his sacrifice. Because I want you to get a sense of where this argument is coming from. Okay? And actually, if you think about it, a lot of the debate, if you do run a libertarian argument, you will have to use rhetoric along these lines if you want to really sound convicted of it. All right. Strategy 3, trade-off impermissible. So here is where we actually get to trying to prove alternate systems to utilitarianism. So I'm basically going to tell you the simplest way to try and prove that Kant is correct. Okay? Now this is not the argument Kant himself makes. No one is actually completely sure what argument Kant himself makes. There are at least 6 different variants of it, 4 different formulations of the same basic idea. I'm going to give you a modern version of it made by a very preeminent philosopher called Christine Korsgaard, which is much easier to follow, and I think you can actually explain fairly quickly in a debate. So basically what you say is that utilitarianism is wrong because people should never be used as a means to an end. Okay? And this is often expressed in debating, in rhetoric, in political discourse, as treating someone as a person versus treating them as a thing. Treating someone as a subject versus treating them as an object. There are 2 ways of proving this. Okay? And there will be discussion of a very famous harmless rape hypothetical here, so just a content warning, alright? Unfortunately, it is one of the most influential things in literature, so we should actually talk about that. Okay, so the 2 ways of proving that you should never use a person as a means to an end. The intuition pumps method and then the analysis method. You should always use both in a debate when you have to actually prove this argument. So, intuition pumps. The first intuition pump is the notion that we all seem to have a certain protected sphere of choice. We all seem to think that we should not live our lives constantly thinking about how to maximize utility to someone else. And the way to think about it is, why do we allow people to have freedom of religion when you could fairly persuasively argue it's not utility maximizing? Why do we allow people to prioritize their loved ones? Why do we allow people autonomy over how they spend their money? The idea here is that the role of government is not to maximize utility, but to create a protected sphere of choice for every individual within which they're free to pursue their own vision of the good life. That's really the underlying idea. There is actually one very famous WUDC debate, which has happened so long ago, I'm pretty sure no one knows about it now. The motion, I think this is quarterfinal, was this House would not enforce wills which discriminate on the basis of race. In other words, if someone writes a racist will, you don't enforce it. Now, if you think about it, that is such an easy prop case. You go, racism, bad, this discourages racism, we shouldn't patent the distribution of resources in society on racism. Okay? Now, how did the opening opposition fairly convincingly win? First, they used foot jamming. They basically asked a POI which said, but you would allow people to prioritize blood relations, right? And then I said, yeah, of course, family relatives. So we said, okay, well, if you allow people to prioritize blood relations, you're prioritizing people on the basis of genetic similarity to you. That doesn't seem that different from a perspective of moral arbitrariness from race, does it? And then from there on, they kind of made a much bigger argument to say, the role of government is not to ensure that all of our interactions are socially utile. The role of government is to allow us some basic freedom. And unfortunately, in order for freedom to mean anything, it must mean freedom to do bad things. If you only have freedom to do the maximally socially utile thing, then you just don't believe the concept of freedom at all. Same argument for freedom of speech, right? You only have freedom of speech if you're allowed to say things which basically are bad. Otherwise, it's meaningless, right? Or at least unpopular. Yeah.
Isn't it different to prioritize one group like your family than discriminate one group on race?
Yeah, so this actually became a thing in the debate. So the other side said, no, this is different. Like, it's what's different is saying, no, I will give money to all my relatives except Timmy, because Timmy is black, or something like that. So the debate became about exactly what the boundary is. And what the other side was like, wait, so if I say I will donate all of my money to only Vietnamese people because I feel really guilty about having fought in the Vietnam War, is that okay? Right, so a lot of the debate then became about exactly what the boundary is. But that's why I say, when you're having these sorts of principle debates, you need to be very careful about trying to draw the lines for principle and show it actually tracks what you're trying to do. Yeah, so I mean, it's a relevant consideration. I don't want to get exactly how you get around these things, but yes, your question is exactly the sort of thing you should be thinking of in prep if you want to run this kind of an argument. Yes, you in the back.
Is it persuasive to push for the notion that all relations are inherently discriminatory to people that are not a part of them? So, like, as a maxim of that notion that you talked about. So, for example, I love my mom, and I want to, and my will, I'm going to leave something to my mom in case I die. But that is also discriminatory because I love her and I have certain emotions from the two.
Yeah, I would say that's a perfectly good strategy in this debate. I mean, I don't want to get into it, but basically what the other side said is, okay, the only distinction between like hating a group and loving another group more is that there's a gap of carrying. So all which matter, morally speaking, is that there's a gap of carrying. So there's no real distinction between saying, I love you more than this other person, or saying, well, I don't love you, but I don't hate you either, and I really dislike this person. So all of it shows that moral calculus is weighted, right, in some way. The question is just whether this weighting is ever legitimate or not, from the government's perspective, right? Anyway, so that's one thing to think about. Yes?
How do you... So it feels like protected spheres of choice can really be easily folded into utilitarianism. How do you separate this more clearly?
Yeah, it's true that there's a very strong rule utilitarian argument for it. I would say the way you make it non-rule utilitarian is to say, if the government only permits you to do the things which maximize social utility and nothing more, then it is treating you as means to an end. And that runs headlong into the Kantian idea. So there is actually a Kantian idea, the notion that you are an agent and you should determine how your life goes, regardless of the consequence, embedded in this notion of a protected sphere of choice. So I'll say that's the way in. Okay, an analogy. So fundamental rights, we'll come on to that later, I'm not going to talk about it now. The organ donor case, we all know the organ donor case, I hope, right? Someone walks into a hospital, they're healthy, should the hospital kill them, harvest their organs to save 5 other people dying in the hospital who could not get organs otherwise? Should we do this? Almost everyone says no. Why is it wrong to harvest a person's organs? Because you're using them as a means to an end. You're not treating them as an agent. You're treating them as an object, not a subject. You're treating them as a life support system for a bag of spare parts, rather than as a self-directed agent with their own dignity. right? That's the organ donor case. It's not obvious which principle the organ donor case shows, though, but you don't need to get into that. I think that's one thing you can use. The other one, I think this is the most influential and powerful one. So I'm a utilitarian myself, and I find this a fairly challenging one. I encourage you to read this article as well. It's become very famous since it was written both in ethical circles, legal circles, and actually it's kind of taken off in a lot of feminist literature as well. Is this article which Professor Gardner wrote called The Wrongness of Rape. Essentially, the hypothetical goes like this. Suppose there's an unconscious person in a room. Suppose that this person will never remember what happened to them while they are in this room. Okay? But suppose there's also another person in that room with this unconscious person who would like to have sex. Right? Now, this conscious person has sex with an unconscious person. Now, a utilitarian would be forced to say, not only was that act of intercourse morally permissible, because no one was harmed, they would say that act was morally desirable, because the person who was conscious got happiness out of it, got their preferences satisfied, whereas by hypothesis, the person who was unconscious will never experience that, will never know that's happened to them. But most people would say there is something profoundly wrong with this, and what's wrong with it is that it's rape, because it was non-consensual penetration, right? And what John Gardner argues is that what this really clearly shows is that the fundamental wrongness of rape as a category of crime, in fact, lots of sexual assault as a crime, is that it's not just about hurting someone, is that you're treating their body as if it's not theirs to determine what to do with. You're using them as a means to an end. And in fact, if you think about it, it is a really pure case of using someone as a means to an end. So on this basis, he argues that we should rethink in that specific article how we think about sexual crimes. Now, I want to go a bit deeper on this, because I did talk about this previously, but I want us to be a bit more rigorous about how we think about this. The first thing I want to note is that this is not far-fetched at all. If any of you here are criminal lawyers, you know that a lot of sexual assault and rape actually happens to unconscious people. Do all of you know about the Giselle Pellicoat case? Right? Over a course of 9 years, this woman got raped something like 72 times by over 50 different men because her husband was drugging her and inviting other men to have sex with her while she was asleep, and then filming it. So, you know, I've encountered people who are like, this John Gardner thing is hypothetical, it doesn't happen in the real world. It happens a lot in the real world. A lot of people also say, but you see, in the real world, when we know that this has happened, then the victim is harmed because the victim actually feels hurt, right? And we should center the wrongness of rape around the feelings of the victim. Is this really persuasive? When you think about this hypothetical, do you really think nothing wrong was done, that no evil came into the world until that unconscious person found out? Are you really convinced about that? The last sub-bullet point there is important as well. Let's assume, you know, the person who was raped, suppose it was a woman. Suppose she finds out she's angry and hurt. Do you think that anger and hurt is a random emotion? Or is it a morally appropriate and correct response? And if it's a morally appropriate and correct response, surely it is only morally appropriate and correct because a wrong has already occurred prior to she finding out that it has occurred. So this is a hypothetical which I would say really powerfully demonstrates that almost everyone really believes that there is something sacred about the body and our ownership of it, and I suppose in a broader sense, the notion that you are not the thing to be used for other people's pleasure. Right? Now, there is a practical problem here, which is that how do you use this in a debate? Right? Because there's a way to use it in a debate which is very crass and a bit off-putting. So all I would say is, please do think about using this in a debate in a way which is tasteful and not an equity violation. Right? You might want to talk about it as something which happens in the real world as opposed to some abstract thing. You might want to talk about it in the case of sexual assault because this actually does happen very commonly in the real world. Yeah, one of the most criminal law philosophers will tell you that the reason why do we have sexual assault as a separate category from assault? Why? Can anyone tell me that? Why? Because assault is wrong. What is different between sexually assaulting someone and stabbing them?
There seems to be an additional harm.
Yeah, what's an additional harm, right? Yeah.
So there's the experiential harm or the pain.
Yeah.
And then the harm that we've just discussed.
Yeah, exactly. So it seems to you that actually this is fairly foundational to how we structure a lot of real criminal law. Now, of course, you can say the psychological harm is different, right? There is a non-consequentialist, there is a consequentialist way of explaining how these things are different, in that, in a purely consequential sense, when you sexually assault someone, it does seem like a more fundamental psychological assault than merely stabbing them. So people say it's often assaulting a sense of psychic integrity. And that is actually distinct from using people as a means to an end. Maybe it is a consequence of that other moral wrong, but that could be another separate way to justify it. Yes, sir?
I'm sorry, but isn't that like separate here? So, like both psychological and like physical harm are something that can be done to a similar extent both by literal assault and essay.
Yeah.
So, like if you beat someone really, really terribly, they're going to be very psychologically traumatized and very physically like.
Yeah, no, totally, completely legitimate consideration. Yeah, completely legitimate consideration. That's why some people, I mean, if you think about it, we do kind of take that into account. So for instance, if you beat someone up, well, for instance, why do we have hate crimes? So if I beat someone up because I hate them and they owe me money, like, we tend to punish that a bit less than if I beat someone up because of the color of their skin. And some people say a reason for that, it's not just general social messaging, is that you often inflict psychological trauma on people about their identity when you beat them up for specific causes. So I think what you say is a perfectly legitimate way of showing the boundary is not precise. I think sometimes you make criminal law based on like generic trends, as opposed to showing that it rigorously categorizes neatly in every case. But completely fair, yeah.
What would you say is the most convincing utilitarian response to what
I would say the most convincing utilitarian response is that the harm of rape is centered around the feelings of the victim. So a utilitarian would be forced to say that evil only springs into the world at the state, the point at which the person finds out about it. Yeah. I don't think utilitarians have any other real options. Of course, there's a cop-out, which is to say in the real world, we should always make this a rule, have a rule against this for rule utilitarian reasons. But I think that solves the problem in the real world. I don't think that fully addresses the force of the argument. I'm happy to concede as a utilitarian, this is a flaw in utilitarianism. This is a flaw. I think it's less severe than the flaws of other moral systems, which is why I'm utilitarian, but this is a flaw in utilitarianism. Yes?
One possible response is you cannot necessarily know the exact outcomes of all of your decisions, so you have to operate on predicted expected value of the action, and you can't know that this person won't find out or it won't do some harm to them. So the expected value is negative, so you are doing harm on the action because you're engaging in.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's a quite nifty way of formulating the rule utilitarian argument. I mean, there are lots of fun variants of utilitarianism which have been used to get around problems like this. Like there's a version of utilitarianism called government house utilitarianism, where it basically says the way to maximize utility is not to ask people to act utilitarianly because they're idiots. The way to make people utilitarian, to have a utilitarian society, is to convince everyone they should be virtue ethicists and obey the government, and then the government acts in a utilitarian way. But everyone is convinced that utilitarianism is wrong. So maybe the most utilitarian world is a world where everyone's convinced it's wrong. You know, that's fair enough. Okay, just two more questions and then we'll move on. Maybe you first? Yeah.
Yeah, my question is more about the application of this. In the ontology, it's not just means to an end, but mere means to an end, right?
Yes,
that
correct.
you're merely instrumentalizing them. So this is a clear-cut case where you are merely instrumentalizing someone. But in most real scenarios where you might apply this, you might have asymmetric instrumentalization.
Yeah, for sure.
Where someone might still get some value out of it. That's just very asymmetric. So how do you go around formulating course card or in that respect? Because that's more about mere instrumentalization.
Yeah, that's a very good point. This argument says that you can't use someone merely as a means to an end. Are you therefore allowed to tax people? The answer is yes, because merely as a means to an end, right? But the question is, well, when does it become merely as a means to an end? That's when you need to use a debating skill called characterization, right? And that's true because remember I talked about how with a protected sphere of choice argument, I said it's legitimate for the government to restrict your freedom, but is it legitimate for the government to only restrict your freedom to the extent that the only actions you can take are actions for utility maximizing? No, because arguably, depending on how well you characterize that in the debate, that becomes you merely being used as a means to an end. So a lot of it comes down to how you characterize the importance of this agency to the individual, how it makes people feel, how much it makes you no longer in a meaningful sense a human. So it's a very good question. There is no blanket answer to that. It's just, are you good at characterizing stuff in a way which persuades the judge, right? But it's a very, very, very important characterization question. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I would just ask, what do you think about formulations of utilitarianism that aren't so much about experiences but about preference satisfaction?
Yeah.
And those then can have things like higher order preferences, that you have a preference to, in this case, not be raped, for example, which would be violated even if you're not aware of that violation.
Yeah. So that's a good question as well. I was hoping to avoid having to discuss variants of utilitarianism. Just FYI, okay, there are lots of different versions of utilitarianism. So there is happiness maximizing utilitarianism, there's preference utilitarianism, which is do whatever people prefer. There's utilitarianism, which says don't care about maximizing happiness, only care about minimizing sadness. There's utilitarianism, which says here's an objective list of good things and we should try and maximize these good things. There's versions of utilitarianism, which says some versions of utility are better than other versions of utility. That one is actually sometimes useful in debates. One which I've used before is the distinction between in pleasures and at pleasures. So, okay, well, brief sidetrack, and then I will answer your question. There are some things which we take pleasure in. These are sensory pleasures. Good food, great sex, we take pleasure in them. And then there are at pleasures, which are pleasures which are not sensory, but mediated by our attitudes, normative attitudes towards the world. Like, I hear that my favorite party has won an election. Now, that's not a sensory pleasure. That is not pleasure in something, that is pleasure at a certain state of affairs in the world. Some utilitarians are trying to argue that at pleasures actually matter more than in pleasures because they're the result of actual choices which we've made and reflect our agency more than unchosen animalistic pleasures. Okay? That actually links to what you just said, because the question was, what if you just say we should just respect people's preferences full stop, right? And that sex without consent violates that preference in an abstract sense. The problem with that is that you come so close to essentially endorsing some kind of Kantian dignitarian consideration as your overwhelming reason for thinking that preferences matter outside of people's ability to perceive them, then essentially you collapse the distinction between utilitarianism and something else. Right? Because a Kantian would say, well, it seems to me that the reason why we should respect that preference, even when you can't sense whether that preference is being violated or not, is because to violate that preference would be to treat you as a means to an end. And then, or some version of that linked to autonomy and agency, and then the distinction kind of collapses. Again, there are preferences to argue is let's not, it's very fun. This is very interesting stuff. I find it super mega interesting. It will probably not help you win any debate in this tournament. Okay, but you know, intellectual rigor, it's a thing. I like it. It's good. Okay, so this actually is a great follow-up to what I just said, because the actual argument for Kant, which I'm going to give you, is based on the notion that agency matters more than pleasure. Okay, so let's start. Step one of the abstract argument is to ask, why is happiness or indeed any outcome valuable? They say it's not just valuable because we like it, it's valuable because you have chosen to endorse it as part of your idea of what makes life worth living. It's part of your vision of the good life, okay? You have reflected on it and you decided, yes, happiness matters to me. Can people choose other things in life which they value apart from happiness? Yes. In fact, if you watch that Thailand WUDC semi-final, all the opposition teams, well, almost all the opposition teams made quite persuasive arguments that there are many people who value things apart from happiness. They talked about saints, revolutionaries, people who act out of a pure sense of duty to their country or their God, or who act in self-sacrificial ways, or who deny themselves access to many forms of pleasure, like physical pleasure, sensory pleasure, because they believe that life ought to be lived according to a certain set of principles. So it's not at all obvious that all people endorse happiness as the ultimate value in their life. Now, of course, some of you are thinking, hang on. No, we can get around this using preference utilitarianism, right? These are all just preferences, aren't they? But then, why do preferences have value? Because they reflect a choice. Why do choices have value? And then actually the argument becomes the exact same argument. So even preference utilitarianism does not get you out of this argument. Because I can see some people making the argument in their heads. I'll come to you in just a moment. I'll get to step two and come to you. Actually, no, let's just do it. Yeah.
Doesn't this also fail to the idea of you calculating and interchangeably using happiness? If it's a preference in terms of, like, categorically, it sounds quite different when you're looking at the preference of someone to be a saint or a savior as opposed to someone doing something that is like basic pleasure of eating food or something like this.
Yeah.
It's really hard to trade these off, right?
Yes, correct. I mean, the basic argument is an argument from sort of incommensurability, right? Like, there's no objective way in which different things can be traded off against each other. Some people have used that as an argument against utilitarianism and in favor of various modes of Kantian reasoning as well. It's just as an aside, Incommensurability is a very strong argument for democracy as well. Do we all know the incommensurability argument for democracy? Okay, well, actually, do I want to sidetrack into non-consequentialist justifications for democracy? Okay, let's just very quickly do that, all right? This is a bracket as an aside, since it's been mentioned. Do we all know the state power principle? Okay, right? State exercises power over you. Okay, fantastic. We will overrun, which is good because it actually does a lot of stuff. State exercises power over you. That power is in want of justification. That only justification can come in the form of you having consented to the power. That consent comes in the form of the vote. There's actually 4 different variants of this principle. You can use in different contexts. We have no time to go through them. Just think about it. The second argument for democracy is the notion of incommensurability. Say that, look, there are many moral questions we face in society which are trade-offs between incommensurable values, right? Abortion. What matters more, the agency of the woman or the life/potential life of the fetus? Immigration. Do we care more about our own citizens or the lives of people who are not part of our polity? Environmental regulation. Do we care more about the lives of hypothetical future people or the lives of people who currently live in our society? Not all of these are the same kind of incommensurable trade-off, but we'll overlook that for now. The argument basically goes, given that these are value-laden questions, or some people say they are not normatively inert, even a government of the greatest technocrats in the world cannot tell you what the correct answer is to these questions. So the only way we can figure out which of these things is more valuable is by asking people to themselves tell us what they think to be more valuable within their own scheme of the good, right? Within their own vision of life. So a big part of the argument for democracy, separate from the consequences, is the notion that if there are no objectively correct answers, or at least no objectively correct answers which a government can access, we need to defer to the will of the people. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's basically it. Anyway, so that's an argument for democracy you should also do. It's also an argument for any for individual choice. So if the debate is this house believes that doctors should make the final choice of children's medical treatments instead of parents, you also make the incommensurability argument. If the argument is this house will legalize drugs, you also make the incommensurability argument. So any debate about maximizing choice, you tend to use an incommensurability argument in one form or another. Incommensurable just means no direct way of comparing/measuring. Okay? Anyway, so step 1. You say, why is happiness valuable? It's only valuable because we choose for it to be valuable. Step 2 is to say, well, if this is only valuable because we have chosen to grant it value, then the real deeper underlying value is our capacity for that choice, the thing which gave us the ability to make that choice. And what gives us our ability to make that choice is the notion that we are free, rational, and independent beings. Okay? So the way you can express this, that sentence at the bottom, consequences only have value by virtue of our free and agentic choices to endow them with value. Okay? And then you say, as the deeper value is people's status as free, rational, independent beings, we cannot act in a way which ignores or neglects or denies this basic premise. And using people purely as a means to an end, or merely as a means to an end, is overlooking this basic moral fact. Crudely put, you are overriding the one fundamental moral value there is to try and achieve things which are of subsidiary value. Okay, so this is the essential idea. Of course, you can pair this together with strategy number 2 to say that there's no way of coherently adding things up, right? So these two strategies work in tandem to show that consequences don't matter in the way a consequentialist team says they do. And you can make this argument in debate. I've made this argument in, well, more often when I was actually, but even in the last decade in my retirement, I've had to make this argument twice. So, it does come up from time to time. Okay? Remember, this is not Kant's argument, this is Korsgaard's argument. It's a bit more complex. It's based around you creating a personal identity you can endorse, but again, you don't need to know that for the purposes of running that in a debate. Okay, last one, strategy 4, and then we'll finish this thing about utilitarianism, and then I'll ask you what the next couple of modules you'd like to do. Yes, in the back.
You said that not everyone is happiness maximizing, that people can follow different stuff. Can't we argue that everything is happiness maximizing because they derive happiness
from it? Yeah. Okay, so if someone says your argument is wrong because at the end of the day people still want to maximize preference satisfaction, which is what you're referring to, then your response is just to say, yes, but why do preferences have value? Preferences have value because preferences are, by definition, the result of a choice. A preference is to say, I would rather have A than B. But why do we care about preferences? Because there was a choice. Then the argument tracks from there on. Okay? All right, cool. Last one, utilitarianism is incomplete. Do we only care about sensations and experiences, or do we care about actually doing worthwhile things, what those sensations are attached to? So I can give you a fairly simple intuition pump to illustrate, to suggest that actually maybe all of you in this room already believe that. Suppose you're studying overseas at university, and one of your parents gets really aggressive cancer and dies, like painfully, okay? Suppose your relatives don't tell you this, because they think it will interfere with your studies. Now, I think most of you would be very upset at that fact when you return and you find out that the fact that someone you deeply loved passed away was hidden from you. My question is, my question is really why? Because a utilitarian would say, because that's not a utilitarian response, right? Because not giving you access to that fact might actually have been happiness maximizing. But why do you still want to know anyway? Because many people think your happiness is not worthwhile if it was based on a lie or deception. Why do people want to find out if their spouses are cheating on them? Either the answer is no, they're not, in which case, well, you're not like made extra happy as a result of that answer. Or the answer is yes, in which case you're deeply upset. Why do people want to know? Because again, you think that living a false relationship premised on deception is not worth the relationship, even if it's happy. So the thought experiment which lots of people use is a kind of Truman Show thought experiment. Suppose there's a professor, right? He's 60 years old, he's got tenure, he's in a loving family, his students like him, his colleagues respect him, and then one day he finds out it's all been a lie. His spouse is cheating on him, his children think he's a waste of time, his students think he's a bogey, and all of his academics think he did his best work in his 30s before he got tenure, and then he just became lazy. And this professor is devastated. Is it a rational response? A utilitarian would say that's not a rational response, because all the happiness you got from early in your life, that's still real. That happiness was still felt. But this person, I suspect, would say, but it wasn't real, it didn't count. And most people seem to think that. And then obviously the last one, yeah.
On that, does it matter if they count it right now, if they have already experienced it for like 10 years, and those 10 years will have a net surplus of happiness, why do we care if he values it now? He literally cannot go back in time and not be happy.
Yeah, so essentially the intuition which you are grasping very firmly there is notion that happiness still happened, it was still real. The question is, when this professor finds out, right, part of his unhappiness is the fact that it is happening now. But part of his unhappiness is almost certainly, if you think about how real humans behave, right, part of this unhappiness would be that they think that their life was wasted. Now, a utilitarian would tell them, no, your life wasn't wasted because that happiness was real. But many people would think that there is something to the claim that life was wasted. Many people would find that response not just emotionally plausible, but rationally justified, on the basis that we should discount that happiness because it wasn't linked to something which was worth that happiness. Now, if you're a utilitarian like me, you might not find that super persuasive, but I think many people actually do, yeah.
A utilitarian way you could say that, though, is that it means he could not act in a utilitarian way, i.e. his spouse, his kids, all of his students were not enjoying their time with him, so he is not maximizing utility, and people want to maximize utility.
Yeah, and entirely fair. But do you think that actually gets to the nub of the point, which is that this person thinks their life was wasted? Not in terms of some obligation to students, but they just think that my life has been fake. The things which I thought made my life worth living turned out not to actually be there. Because you could easily take away the consequential considerations, right? I think some of the earlier thought experiments actually get to that, like what happens if a parent dies? There's no greater overbalancing interest, but you would still feel that there's something wrong. Or at least most people would. Okay, we don't have quite enough time. I'll have to rush a bit. If we have time, we'll come back to this at the end. The last one is just the relationships exist that create special morally relevant categories of people. We've already talked about this in terms of the zone of freedom, the notion of a protected zone of freedom. But again, I think it's fairly intuitive to many people that parent-child relationships generate moral obligations. By the way, you can argue it both ways, yeah? You can say children owe parents special obligations, but also parents and children special obligations. State citizen, there are many, many, many different versions of this. There's a state power principle, then there's notion that if you tax someone, you can give stuff back to them. There's notion that because I constituted you and I voted for you, therefore to care about me more. There's many different variants of this. And there's organ donor case again. The organ donor case, I say, can be a variant of this. Because if you think about it, A hospital or any medical establishment makes an implicit promise to people who visit it, right? The implicit promise is that I will make you better. I will help you. If you think about it, what do surgeons do? What are medical professionals allowed to do? They're allowed to do things to you which in any other circumstance would be a fairly gross, disgusting crime. Like cut you open and fiddle around in your insides. Whenever you go into a medical establishment, you're putting yourself in a state of extreme vulnerability vis-a-vis some medical authority. And the idea is that you've only done that because they've made an explicit or implicit promise not to hurt you and only to try to help you. And the notion is that by inducing someone to put themselves in a vulnerable state by making a promise, you create an obligation on yourself not to go back on the promise. Some people call this, well, you can call it induced vulnerability. In legal terms, they call this detrimental reliance. When you rely on someone as a result of a promise they have made to your own detriment, they have an obligation not to go back on that. And this concept of detrimental reliance is the foundation of a big part of the law called equity, which you do not need to know about. It's interesting, but not relevant to what we're talking about here. Okay? Alright, so that ends the utilitarianism portion. Now, we can talk about rights or choice of criminal justice. What did we talk about? Rights? We have time? Okay, alright. Oh gosh. I need to sit.
For those of you who have public speaking or master's things, please be aware that time passes and time burns, so this may elapse.
Okay. Alright, let's talk about rights. Okay, because rights kind of does follow on very naturally from this. Jesus Christ.
You're gonna go into heaven. You're doing God's work here.
Yes, I tried. You need water? I've got water. Thank you. Alright, let's talk about rights. Okay. First, some intellectual hygiene. This was on the YouTube video, so I'll go through this a bit quickly. And then arguing for rights, I'll spend a bit more time on that. So just a little brief on it. I say this with all the force my slightly exhausted body can now muster. Rights are really not things we like. Okay? Broadly speaking, we use the word right to refer to three very distinct categories of things. Number one, I'll start from the bottom, legal rights. A legal right is just something which you are allowed to do. It is a meaningless category, because I have a legal right to put on clothes in the morning. I have a legal right to eat at Burger King. These rights do not give you any arguments to purchase in an actual debate. Okay? Unfortunately, that's how a lot of our political discourse works, so what can I say? The second category of right are what we call civil or political rights. Broadly speaking, these are rights which you need for you to be living in a democracy. So freedom of speech, freedom of association. Some people would say privacy. Some people would say freedom from arbitrary discrimination. Okay? And then there are real or fundamental rights. These are very rare, and these are absolute. If something is a fundamental right, it is absolute. Okay? By definition, you can't balance a right, because if you're balancing a right, it isn't a right. A right is there so that you can't balance it. Okay? Now, note a cross-cutting categorization. I'll come to you in just a second. There are what we call positive versus negative rights. Positive rights are rights to something. It's a right which says, you need to give me something. A negative right is a right which says, you are not allowed to do a certain thing to me. Okay? So I'm just going to show of hands. I'm just going to ask you whether something is a positive or negative right. Okay. Right to freedom from torture. Positive or negative right? Negative. Okay, good. Right to freedom from slavery. Positive or negative right? Okay. Right to education. Right to freedom of speech.
Negative.
Negative. Right to freedom of speech is negative. So just note that whether a right is positive or negative has nothing to do with how it's phrased. The right to freedom of speech is a right for the government not to be punished. Well, right for the government not to punish you if you say something they don't like. Okay. So just note this. Okay, it's not super important, but it's actually relevant in a couple of debates. So there's sort of two questions at the back. Can I just take those now? Yeah.
I just want to ask if anyone could open some windows. It's 0,
oh yeah.
At least up here.
Sure, I don't mind. I'm okay with it. I'm happy to open windows if someone's opened a couple of windows. Yeah. And anyone, just go ahead and do it. You know.
Maybe these windows down there are the best because
people are sitting there.
Yeah. Okay. There's another question coming from over there. Yes. Yeah. Any question? Yeah.
Okay. So might this be context dependent? For example,
example, in a situation where if the government doesn't intervene, you don't have the freedom of speech because you're living in some kind of dystopia where no one is allowed, with everything is censored by social media or something like this. Wouldn't it then realistically turn to a positive right?
Yes, actually, what you are hinting at is a really fundamental dispute in political philosophy between classical and modern liberals. So, classical liberals will say the most important rights are negative rights, because the greatest restrictions of our freedom come from governments. Modern liberals will say the greatest restrictions on our freedom come from not having the capacities to meaningfully exercise them. So a classical liberal would say taxation is a violation of liberty. A modern liberal would say, but how can you have rights if you are poor? You can't exercise them. You know that famous quote, right? The law and its majestic equality equally permits the noble and the starving beggar, equally prohibits the noble and the starving beggar from sleeping beneath bridges. Right? So yes, a classical liberal, a modern liberal would say in response to the notion that freedom of speech is negative, they would say, no, but for you to have freedom of speech, what do you need? You need an education. Because how are you supposed to meaningfully formulate your views and express your views and convey them to people without education? They might even say freedom of speech necessitates the government's creating forums where people are able to speak up freely. Right? And that's a more modern liberal view of how we ought to think about government and citizens compared to a classical liberal view. Classical liberals are only concerned about government's restrictions and citizens' power. Okay? I mean, you see this like in modern political discourse all the time, right? Republicans will be like, oh, the Democrats are taking away our freedoms. And then Bernie Sanders will be like, do you think you're seriously free when you've got no health insurance? You've got to be kidding me. And they may not be pretending to be having a philosophical debate, but actually they are. Right? One side, this is going classical liberalism. The other side, no, modern liberalism. And you go, if only you could extract and examine your premises, but no one's going to do that in politics, are they? Sorry, random aside. Anyway, so that's all real rights. What are real rights? As I said, they are counter-utilitarian, they're anti-consequentialist, they are absolute, which obviously makes them very useful in debates when you want to prove something absolute or justify something which looks creepy. Okay? What are some absolute rights? There are very, very few. I can only think of like 4 or 5. Just as a point, the right to life is obviously not absolute. It's one of the least absolute rights out there. You are allowed to kill people in self-defense. Nations are allowed to fight wars in self-defense. If you believe the right to life is absolute, then, I don't know, like Ukraine could not have fought back against Russia on the battlefield, because that would be a violation of fundamental rights, okay? The things which people have kind of agreed arguably are fundamental: right to freedom from torture, right to freedom from slavery, right to freedom of thought, right to self-defense. The right to freedom of thought is a bit of a cop-out, because it has no consequences, right? Like I said, yeah, you're free to think whatever you want, just don't say it. Just a bit of whatever. Although it is sometimes relevant. Like in a debate about the moral enhancement drugs, you would actually talk about the right to freedom of thought as being fundamental. So I'm not saying the right to freedom of thought is useless, just don't use it that much in debates in a real sense. Okay? So here are some examples of things which you should know, where I think you can use these fundamental rights as very fun analogies. So this is a story I always like to tell: violence is a legitimate response to poverty. I'm sure some of you have heard this story. How many of you know this story? It's quite a fun little one. Okay, so basically it's round. It's also, I think, an illustration of how you need to do characterization legwork to make arguments, to make principal arguments stick sometimes. So I think this was round 5 of the. Sorry? LSE Open. LSE, it was round 5 of the LSE Open 2015. The LSE Open is like some big dino tournament in the UK, where all of like the wizened Euros champions and world finalists and ones, whatever, just creep out of the woodwork and all debate together. It's very fun because like you go as a novice, you win round 1, and then in the next room you're like, oh, why is everyone here like made a final at Worlds? And then you get beaten up, and then you learn a lot, and then you either stop debating or you find it inspiring. Anyway, so it was round 5 of the LSE Open 2015, and the motion was: this House believes violence is a legitimate response to poverty. Okay, so we were closing government. So Shrek and I were closing government. Now, opening government said violence is a legitimate response. Now, you see the word legitimate, right? That should cue you in. Because it's politically effective. It calls attention to the problems of inequality in society. It forces governments to overlook it. It ensures that there are all these kinds of interesting political effects. They made a practical argument, basically. Then the opening opposition said, here are 17 ways in which this could potentially backfire, depending on what exactly happens. And also, you're going to hurt other people when you're violent, which is bad. So we're listening to all of this, or at least we predicted and prepped that all of this would happen, and we were thinking, can we make a principal argument that you have a right to be violent, even if you don't, in any practical sense, resolve the problems of poverty in society? And so we eventually did think of a way to go about it. So the first thing we did was that we spent, out of our 15 minutes of prep, we spent 10 minutes thinking of a POI, which would force the other side to recognize a right of collective self-defense. So the POI which was eventually given was something along the lines of, when the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto rose up against the SS, they knew they were going to die. Does it lie in your mouth to tell the Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto to go silently into the night? Pause. This person said, like genocide's obviously different from poverty, right? Like these are not even remotely the same thing. To which the response in Chung Wu's next speech was like, so you're saying that if you put a bunch of people in a place and you kill them because of their race, then you have collective self-defense. If you put a bunch of people and you let them die because they are poor, that does not trigger collective self-defense, that does not make sense. So that was part one, get them to just concede the existence of collective self-defense. Weirdly enough, I found out about this way later, that Jews of the Warsaw Ghetto thing, POI, somehow got out of that room and wormed its way into like the Thessaloniki final in like, I think Fanele's speech. Because I think like MDG had a chat with him about it, and it sort of popped up there as well. It's sometimes funny to trace where arguments end up from the origins. Anyway, then what Chung Wu did in his speech, and I like this story because I think it shows how you can demonstrate principal arguments in a way which is very intuitive as opposed to purely analytical. During his speech, the first thing he did was that he walked over to a speaker on the opening opposition, European champion actually, and picked up this person's phone. I will not name them. You will find out if you really want to dig it up. He picked up this person's phone and he said, in my hand, I now have Bob's phone. Okay? If I take Bob's phone and I keep walking down the street, at some point, Bob's phone will return to Bob. And it is not going to return to Bob because the property right magically asserts itself. The phone is going to get back to Bob because an agent of the state is going to come up to me, knock me down, and rip this phone out of my hand. Property rights are violence. They're not structural violence, they're not metaphorical violence, they're just violence. And if property rights are violence, I have the right to defend myself against that violence. Right? And everyone kind of went, damn, it kind of works, doesn't it? Right? So that's an example. So in response to your question, right, about how do you characterize something as a violation of right, like, a lot of it comes down to stuff like this. Can you think of a persuasive way to characterize things in a way which triggers the existence of a right to something? If you have a right to self-defense, then you need to say you're defending yourself against something. So the right to self-defense can only activate as an argument if you prove there is an attack. But what is that attack? That's up to you to decide, right? Again, the example there, legalized production and sale of memory alteration drugs, the argument which Tigway and I made in extension, and Tigway was the one who suggested this, we were closing government, we were closing government, well, how do we say that memory alteration is a fundamental right? We couldn't think of any way to do it, and at some point, very late in the program, I remember this was like the 13th or 14th minute, he was like, couldn't we say memory is a bit like slavery? And then I thought about it over the debate, and I thought actually it kind of worked. So the argument we ended up making was that memory determines identity. You are what your memories tell you are, right? If we stopped memory, you would just become me. Our decisions are based on our identities, what we value, who we are. So all of our decisions are determined by our past selves and our memories of our past selves. While that sounds very much like you don't have any real choice, that you're enslaved by your past self. Well, if you're in every meaningful moral sense enslaved by your past self, you have a right to defend yourself against your past self, to murder your past self. Now, since I cannot actually do that, given the non-existence of time machines, the closest I can get to murdering my past self is to eliminate all traces my past self has had on me, which is to kill my memories of me. And that liberates me. And so now I can actually have freedom for the first time in my life. So that was the argument we made, right? Which, if you think about it, is not that counterintuitive, because a big part of the argument for prop, anyway, is to say that we have a right to alter ourselves, but this just frames it in a more powerful, non-consequentialist way. Does that make sense? Right? Yeah. And you can also, by the way, frame this as a demonstration. Thinking about it now, you can frame it in a more practical way. So if you don't like making arguments in that kind of a more abstract or extravagant way, you can say, look, many people want to leave their past lives behind. Many people want to not have baggage. Many people want to be able to start their life anew. We cannot do that because we are strictly determined by what we've already done in our lives. Why should I not have the capacity to look through the world with total new eyes? Why should I not have the capacity to watch my favorite movie as if I have never watched it before and to feel that sense of awe again? Well, you could do that, and that frames it in a more practical way. So as I said, with principal arguments, there are many ways you can make them work, and you have to figure out what works for your own style. Unfortunately, this is not super helpful for you in WUDC. This is the first time you're hearing of it. But if you try this out in debates at tournaments, you will get much better at this. Like, I lost the first 10 times I tried to run a wacky principle, and then eventually I figured out, oh, this stuff works. And then what I'm telling you now is just the stuff which works, right? I'm not telling you all the bad arguments I've made. Okay, how do you argue for rights? Utilitarianism, just say this makes people happy, so let's treat it like it's a right. Number 2, rule utilitarianism. We've talked about it. I don't need to go through it again. Analogies, right? So we've already done that. If you can show that something which you're debating about triggers a right or violates a right because the thing which is being violated is like what the right was meant to protect against, then your argument works. So again, I'm going to explain this. And lastly, the Kantian argument works. The fundamental argument for these basic inviolable rights is to say that, and I'm phrasing this very loosely, in a way which captures the intuition rather than the argument itself. If you think without a right, you would not meaningfully be a person anymore, then that thing is a fundamental right. That really is the intuition behind it. Like, if you don't think that you'll be a person without this thing, then you can argue it's a fundamental right. And that kind of links to the Kantian idea, right? Dignity, agency, so on and so forth. Okay, so I just want to leave all of you with this. I'll come to you in just a moment. You need to really characterize how that right matters to people. If you cannot do characterization, or if you're uncomfortable with showing why something deeply matters to people, either analytically or emotionally or using historical precedent, then it'll be very hard to argue that something is actually a fundamental right. Yeah, a question at the back there.
Yeah, I was thinking about how do you sell or weigh things that expand rights as opposed to contracting. I think it's much more intuitive to explain that something that contracts our rights is a bad thing, but the current scope for how we see rights, for example, the memory stuff. Currently, there is no memory wiping machine.
Yeah.
But perhaps it is a very strong limitation on us. It's just that we're not proceeding it that way because we don't think of it existing. How do we frame expanding rights as something that is really important, as not just another good benefit cherry on the top?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. The easiest way, practically speaking, is to find groups of people for whom that limitation is much more than merely abstract, and then generalize outward from there. So to give you the memory wiping example, you would use, I would suppose, more typical examples of people who have suffered kind of traumatic episodes, or who are unable to have good relationships because something went badly, so on and so forth. And then you generalize out from there. So you can say, for lots of people, this is a real harm, but I want to point out how this affects all of us. And then you just try and characterize it, yeah.
How do we say this is not just like us calculating utilitarianism, and it's really bad for this person, but this is something that necessarily, as a right, we all need to have? Because I think implicitly what would happen is the other side would try to mitigate it, and then say we have more happiness on our side of the house.
Yeah, I mean, potentially, I think the way you go beyond proving that it is about maximizing utility rather than showing that it's about right rather than maximizing utility is how rigorously you can track the wrong of not being able to erase your memory with the wrong of, for instance, slavery. Right? So if you say the fundamental thing which is wrong with slavery or torture is this, and note that the exact same moral wrong is being perpetrated in this case. Right? And then if the other side says, but do you really feel like it's a problem? You said, look, honestly, if you look at history, many people who we now think of as living under horrible oppression, if you ask them how they were living, they would have been like, it's not great, but it's not like I don't want to live. Right? And so often we're just blinkered by the social context in which we happen to live. Many lives which we would think of as not worth living right now because of restrictions on basic rights and freedoms, people who are living them in the past thought they were fully worth living and not great, but also kind of okay. Right? So I think you can make reference to that as well, to try to put it in historical context. Okay? So yeah, don't sound like being abstract. Please ask yourself practically why you value this thing. People, like, a piece of advice I always give to people is don't think like a debater. Like ask yourself, if I ask the average person in the street what's wrong with it, and the average person would say something, that thing the average person would say is usually the heart of the best possible argument. Yeah, we make it a bit too technical sometimes, but it's just me ranting now. Let's not do that. So using these 4 techniques, can someone tell me why privacy is a really important right? Maybe not fundamental and inviolable. Can you try applying what we've learned to privacy? Because it's very hard to justify, right? It's like, well, if not doing anything wrong, why are you scared of government surveillance? Anyone? Yeah, actually, I'm more interested in like the I suppose the last 2, because they're a bit more interesting. But anyway, yeah.
You would likely feel pressured because you now understand the power that the government has upon you.
But why? Yeah.
Vulnerable.
Makes you feel vulnerable. But why does it make it a fundamental right?
Because
why is not feeling vulnerable or watched a fundamental right? Why does it matter so much? Why are you no longer a human being if you're being watched all the time? Anyone? Yes.
Because having an identity of your own entails being able to choose some of the parts of that identity, I guess, that you want to share with others and the parts you don't. Okay, having an identity of your own means having choice over what part of identity you share with other people. Yes, very promising. We'll actually circle back to that in a moment. Oh God, I just said circle back. I'm sorry. I worked for a while. It slips out sometimes. Yes?
Maybe that infringing on your, that making you feel vulnerable infringes on your freedom of thought. That you are, and then
infringes on your freedom of thought. Okay, how?
That is an absolute right because you are unable to. You are. I'm not sure how to formulate.
Yeah, but I mean, you're actually going along exactly the correct path. You all the way there at the back, in purple. Yes.
My phone is kind of like an extension of my body. The government is essentially using my body then for a means to an end.
Yeah. Okay. So I would actually separate those 2 out. I'll say the analogy of bodily integrity is a useful one because, like, the boundaries of myself are not just my body, right? Like, my psychic integrity matters as well. The sense of what information other people can perceive is just as much an assault on my control over who I want to be as a physical assault. Yeah. Yes.
If my ability to engage in society, it could be limited to people knowing some fact about me, then I have to be able to hide that fact about myself in order to engage in society and use my other rights.
Yep, okay, and I suppose the argument generalized, especially powerfully, outward from particularly vulnerable groups, for instance. Yes, you just in front. Yeah, with the mask, yes.
So we're saying to prove privacy's rights.
Yes, correct.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking like maybe it's quite important for us to be able to experiment with things that we wouldn't want people to know we were experimenting with, to actually discover our true preferences and beliefs. And
okay, good. So a big part of identity formation is experimentation. You can't experiment if you think you're being watched, right? Because that somehow makes you feel more vulnerable. So, in the interest of time, I will pause things there because there's lots of other fun stuff as well. We might or might not get through. But yes, I think actually almost everything which has been said is essentially in the right direction. So that's nice. So let's just I have some things I've written out just as thoughts to illustrate these techniques. People like having privacy. Treat 1. Treat number 2 is quite obvious, right? The rule utilitarian argument. If the state can surveil everyone without limitation, then inevitably these powers of mass surveillance will be brought to bear on particularly vulnerable groups, on political opponents, on people who are seen as disordered or dangerous in some loose sense. And then analogies, we just heard that. Psychic integrity less important than physical integrity. Okay. The Kantian argument, here are some things we want to think about. And actually, a lot of the stuff which was said tracks this. Right? One way is to say, well, privacy protects a domain of selfhood which can never be used or owned or accessed by someone else. And that means there's always a part of me which will never be used as a means, ever. Right? And you can even make a more fundamental psychological argument. You can say fundamental to the sense that I am me, my sense of psychic integrity, is that I am not fully knowable to other people. That I am the only one with true access and control to who I am. And people find it to be fundamentally important. Now, you would then need to characterize this a bit more. Talk about what are the sorts of things people have done to protect their privacy and identity. And then we also reference the autonomy argument, which someone referenced as well. There are many things which I don't dare to do if I know I'm being observed. So the only state within which I have total freedom to experiment, to really be who I am, in a way which is untrammeled by the existence of external agents, is this. And I think what you want to emphasize here is like the rarity of a sphere like this. How rare it is to have that kind of a space. And then you can also say this is important for, like someone mentioned, identity formation, or indeed formation of our moral and political positions, right? Like, I have read neo-Nazi literature online because I want to know what these people think and the arguments they make. Now, would I have read an argument online if I knew I was being surveilled? Probably not. But confronting views like this, which society might find abhorrent or weird or out there, is part of how people ought to develop their moral views. Or at least consuming this kind of content, right? Or even consuming really bizarre sexual content, which you might or might not find to be something which turns you on. But you are unable to form a lot of these basic positions about yourself if you cannot experiment, and privacy is fundamental to that. The last argument is something which I encountered in philosophical literature. I was thinking of whether to put this in the slide. I think you can actually just about make it in a debate, which is to say, intimacy can only exist with privacy, because privacy is the way you form intimate relationships is by giving other people access to very vulnerable parts of you. But if you're constantly being surveilled, you don't have capacity, you don't dare to give people access to those intimate parts of you. Right, think about gay individuals, for instance. Okay, yes, so that ends the bit on rights. We went through that actually shockingly fast. I mean, well, we're still at 4:30 anyway, but we went through that fairly efficiently. Any questions at this point? Okay. How many questions should I take? How burning are the questions exactly?
Maybe you can just take all of them at the end.
Take all of them at the end? I'll take all of them at the end?
Sometimes it's too fast, I think. Just
yeah, okay. Well, okay. How many are questions which could not be taken at the end? Well, of course everyone says yes. There's nothing debaters, right? Okay, well, I'll take them at the end. I will just talk about this one thing on choice. This will take 15 minutes. So, because this last one is, it's like 7 slides. So, okay. So, many debates are about whether certain choices are legitimate or ought to be respected by the government. Okay. So just note that. I must say, very often people don't realize when they're having debates about choice. Recently, I saw a bunch of fairly good debaters debate the motion, this House supports the use of forcible resettlement as a solution to poverty. And all of the debate was about whether resettlement works or not. When the debate's about the word forcible. Because anytime the prop says resettlement is good, the op will go, we can give many positive incentives for people to move. And if there are so many benefits, given that people are rational, they will move. Why must you force them to move? Right? So no one talked about collective action problems, no one talked about irrationality. Very odd. So it's not, I know this slide makes it look obvious when a debate's about choice. Very often people do forget heat at the moment. Just a small thing to bear in mind. Again, this is super basic, but just take note. There are only 2 circumstances under which you can override choice. Only 2. Okay, we've been thinking about this issue for about 3,000 years, and we've only thought of these 2 categories. Number 1, because there was never real choice to begin with, because you were irrational or already coerced. Okay? Now, how do you prove that someone is irrational? You either prove they don't have access to information, or that they cannot process the information. And usually when you're saying that someone can't process information, you are making reference to something which we call cognitive bias. Do we all know what cognitive biases are? If you don't, just ask ChatGPT to give you a list of like 10 with illustrations, and that will do the work which I don't need to do. Anchoring bias, cognitive dissonance, whatever, herd mentality, proximity bias, all this stuff. It's all good stuff, it's very easy to explain. And the only second circumstance where we can override choice is where there's an overriding social good. Now you note, of course, that this interacts with the debate about utilitarianism versus, deontology versus rights. Because obviously rights exist to say you can't override certain choices even when there is an overriding social good. So that's why I say you need to do the utilitarianism versus other stuff module first. Otherwise a lot of this stuff kind of hangs without foundation. Alright, I'm going to give you 4 models of choice. Okay? These models are more demanding, they become progressively more demanding. Whenever you are trying to argue that a choice is not legitimate or flawed, you are going to try and use a more demanding model. Whenever you are trying to argue that a choice is legitimate, you want to use a less demanding model of choice. So let's go through the four models. The first model is what I'm just going to call the naive model. You have choice when you have options. This looks very simple, but it's actually very powerful, especially as a rebuttal. Suppose it's a debate, again, like a very simple debate about whether we would legalize sweatshops, whether we would allow prisoners to, I don't know, sell their organs in return, or like go for dangerous medical trials in return for reduced sentences. If the other side says this is coercive, you are undermining choice, your response is to say, how can adding one option to a list of pre-existing options reduce choice? That sounds very trivial. It's not easy to respond to that. Right? You say, well, we're coercing a prisoner by giving them an option, but surely if they never had that option, they were more coerced because they didn't have that option, right? And you'll be surprised how often this makes it quite difficult for the other side. Of course, the other side will say, but you can't rationally process this. So then you say, I mean, it's quite obvious. You're selling organs for reduced. That's not difficult, right? So this is the first model. Surprisingly useful. Second model is what I call the default model. So choice equals options plus rationality. And again, rationality comprises those two things I just talked about. Having the information you need and being able to process the information you need. Some philosophers express this in terms of whether or not an agent is appropriately responsive to reasons. You can only have choice when you as an agent are appropriately responsive to reasons. Okay? And this just involves being able to cite cognitive biases. I won't go through this because it's all fairly straightforward. I will say at the very least you need to know confirmation bias. You need to know short-termism, or what people sometimes call bounded horizons or proximity effect. You will need to know anchoring bias. These are three basic biases which I would say in almost every debate where you want to impugn decision-making, you can quite easily summon to your aid. Okay, next. Sorry, I should just put this into these notes so it's easier to see. Okay. Then there's the fairness model. Choice means options plus rationality plus fairness. So the thorn experiment I always use to illustrate this is considered the drowning man case. So you walk past a lake, there is a drowning person in it. As per the usual thorn experiment, you are the only person who can save them. This person is screaming for help. You yell back at this person, I will jump in and save you, but only if you agree to give me 99% of everything which you own in life. The person screams back, yes, I will, just save me, I don't want to die. I jump in, I save them. Now, did that person who was drowning have options? Yes. They could have refused my offer, they had options. Was their decision-making rational? It was, stupendously rational. They had all the information they needed and they processed it well. Was this transaction mutually beneficial? It was. I got his wealth, he got to keep his life. So what exactly is wrong? The idea is that you don't look at the person who's making the choice to figure out what was wrong with it. You look at the person who was offering that choice. The reason why this choice was not legitimate was because when I made him that offer, I had on my mind making money as opposed to saving a life. I adopted an attitude towards a dying human being of exploitation and selfishness rather than recognizing that person's life as being valuable because it's a human life. That's what's wrong. So you can explain this in terms of kind of Kantian non-exploitation principle. I was using that person as a means to an end. Right? Or you can explain it in terms of unequal bargaining power, which is a more typical economic way of looking at things. If anyone wants, by the way, to because this argument can be used in so many debates, it's a general piece of advice. If you want to argue that there's unequal bargaining power between two parties, the only one question you need to ask yourself is, who can afford to walk away from the negotiation? It applies in all kinds of commercial contexts as well. So in this case, the drowning person obviously can't walk away from negotiation because they will die. Right? If it's a large company offering someone working in a sweatshop a job, the person might not be able to walk away because the company might have monopoly labor buying power in that particular sector of the economy on a particular geographic region, whereas to the company, this person is just a perfectly substitutable unit of labor. So who can walk away from that negotiation? The company, but not the individual, hence unequal bargaining power. Just like a little heuristic you can use for those sorts of debates. So that's the fairness model of choice. In order for this model to work, you need to show that there is a better option which can be offered. Like, if you don't show there's a better option which can be offered, this argument does not work, yeah? If in other words, the only way I can have been induced to jump in and save the person's life is by taking 99% of the wealth, it's hard to argue that the better option was for me not to do anything at all. Right? You always need to be arguing that what I ought to have done was to have saved him without wanting so much in return. But depending on what specific policy that debate's about, that better option might not actually exist. So just be aware of that. Okay? So the other side might say, but if you make sweatshops implement tighter labor standards, they might never come into your country at all. So you need to show that that argument is not called for this to fully work. Yeah? Last one, the freedom model. There's a weak and a strong version of it. The weak version is just choice equals options plus rationality plus fairness plus no coercion. That is why if a robber walks up to you and puts a gun to your head, that's not real choice, because they're coercing you. Right? You had options, you had rationality, and in a way, I guess it's unfair, but if you think about it, the unfairness was something which the robber themselves had created. Right? In my earlier thought experiment, I didn't throw you into the lake. I just found you in the lake. But in this case, the robber puts you in a situation where your choices are limited. Okay, so the basic idea, choice is freedom from domination. I presume we don't need to really talk about that. There is a much more demanding version of it. This version of choice is so demanding, some people say it can never really be fulfilled. That's probably true, but this is still a very useful way to rank the extent to which a choice is legitimate or not. So even using this last most demanding model, you might say, maybe there is no fully perfect or legitimate choice, but there are certainly more and less legitimate choices. So the idea is that you are not really free. This is the first way of expressing it. You're not really free unless you can choose the circumstances of your choice. This is a very Marxist idea. It comes out of left-wing thought. Right? So this is how people say, under capitalism, there is no truly free consumption. And we already referenced that earlier when we were talking about how you could say we need moral enhancement drugs. Because we are all born into a world where we are saddled with particular inclinations and choices. Okay? So that's the first basic idea. The second basic idea is a notion that a choice is only free if it expresses your authentic self and flows from desires which you can reflectively endorse. Essentially, there are some similarities between this argument and the argument for Kantian deontology. The basic idea is that the only choices which really matter in your life are not the choices which you made because you had no other option or because you had to, but the choices which matter are those which pursue your specific vision of the good life. So to give you like a very simple toy example of this, if I am angry with you because you gave me a fall and I punch you, in the moment I clearly act on a preference I have, which is to physically hurt you for a totally unjustified fall. But you could say that's not a real choice, because what I really want to be is not the kind of person who punches other people, right? And that is a higher order desire. It's a second order desire. It is a desire about the kind of desires I have. I want to be the kind of person who does not want to punch people. And so some people will say it is the higher order desire which reflects who you really want to be, which is a legitimate choice. And this is actually surprisingly important in a whole bunch of debates about what kinds of choices you want to make. Because arguably many choices don't actually express this particular sense of who you want to be. Okay? Anyway, that's all for choice. See, that wasn't so painful. That was pretty fast. Okay, let's wrap things up here, since we've already gone past time a little bit. Questions? Questions? There are also a bunch of questions. Let's take them.
Before we get questions, I just want to have everybody give Ashish a big round of applause.
Great, thank you for giving your time, of course.
Ask questions.
It was a pleasure. You're such a wonderful, engaging audience. No. Yes, questions. Maybe you in front here because you asked.
Yeah. It wasn't clear to me why non-absolute rights are not real rights that we protect.
I was just telling you what, in ethical philosophy, the definition of right is. Of course, you can use civil and political rights as well. Remember we talked about thresholding very early on? You can use an absolute right as thresholding. You can say this is an absolute right. And having done that, you can say, well, even if it's not absolute, at least our program judges, this stuff really freaking matters to people, so we can't override it easily. Yeah, no, so you're completely correct. It's just a word. You give it whatever meaning you want. Someone else a question?
Is that actually for choice is coerced fails? As in, isn't coercion a subset of fairness? Like, is any choice which is not worth fair?
Maybe. I mean, honestly, those are just labels I use to help to like make sure there's some delineation. So long as you recognize that those two things are not strictly the same. In other words, fairness covers circumstances where the agent offering you a choice hasn't manufactured the choice. The freedom model tends to apply in situations where someone has manufactured the choice for you. That's the distinction between like the drowning man case, where the circumstances were not manufactured, and the gun to the side of the head case. Yeah. Yes.
So my question is more on applying running rights based in non-consequentialism versus just running non-consequentialism on its own.
Yeah.
Because see if like your right, like self-defense, is based on nausea, which is premised in Kant, you might run into the issue of like, oh, if I kill someone in self-defense, you're violating their dignity. So to that extent, if the fundamental premise is dignity, and you violate that to satisfy nausea side constraint, then I don't know how you violate it.
Yeah, I think we're not talking about criminal justice, so I didn't have a chance to tell you the argument for retribution / killing people. Maybe I will just tell you the argument for how you can say that people forfeit rights when they act in certain ways. The basic argument, there are many different versions of this argument. I'll give you the one which I find the most succinct. The argument goes, when you are asking that your rights be respected, whether you're talking about negative or positive rights, you are limiting other people's freedoms as well. If I say I have a right to education, I'm asking that you be taxed. If I say that I have a right to physical integrity, I'm saying that you should not be permitted to assault me. So the assertion of a right is inherently morally problematic because it's an act of dominion. It's an act of saying, I demand of you certain things, full stop. Under what circumstances could such an act of dominion, could such a request be considered morally appropriate? If, in the very act of asserting a right, you also agree to restrict your freedoms in the exact same way, to the same extent, you are demanding that other people restrict your freedoms as well. What this means is that if you prove yourself incapable of or unwilling to restrict the basic interests of other people, to restrict your freedoms in those ways, you do not have the right to assert those protections. So we could pair that with the dignity argument to say that someone who assaults you viciously clearly does not respect really fundamental parts of your identity. And in the process of doing so, they forfeit the capacity to assert certain rights against you. If you push this argument to its extreme, what it is really saying is that all human beings have fundamental inalienable rights, but there are points in time where you don't count as a human being, where essentially you are an animal. So Catholic philosophers tend to make a variant of this where they say people who are unrepentant, repeated murderers, for instance, have shown themselves to essentially be not that different from animals. They do not have second-order desires. They do not have any sense of normative constraint. And if you don't have any sense of normative constraint, you are really not a human being in a morally relevant sense because you have no capacity to reflect on your first-order brute desires. And that renders you not a human being in the Kantian sense, because Kant's argument only applies to beings which are capable of rational self-reflection, which are capable of dictating moral rules to themselves. That's really like the fuller version of the argument. Yeah.
So I have a follow-up to that.
Yeah.
So it's a very specific case where you have rights forfeiture, right? But you might also have cases where there's no right forfeiture. So an example I might give is, say, I can make an argument that plugging myself into experience machine is a self-defense against the violence that I face in the real world. But another option can make an argument that this is a deontological harm to all the beings that you create in that experience machine.
Yeah.
Right? So if your self-defense is based in deontology, then you run into the issue where
So really, it would then come down to a characterization battle about who does better at showing that there is an assault and that one side is defending, has like more of a legitimate claim to the right to self-defense. Now, there's a variant of a question which you've also hinted at, which I should address, which is that what if one side claims, but we're just maximizing dignity on this side as well, right? That if you don't torture the terrorists, what you're actually doing is violating other people's dignity because they will die. The response is to say that, it's essentially to say, what if other people, there's two ways of responding. Kant's way to say, but if other people die, it's not your fault. Because all you can do is respect the dignity of the person in front of you. But that runs an act of mission distinction. The more fundamental response is to say, but dignity is something which you can't really add up. or some in any meaningful sense. It is just an inherent feature of beings which they have. So long as you neglect the dignity of even one agent, you should not be permitted to undertake an action under any circumstance. This argument can get very complicated and abstract meta-ethical. But we don't have to go into it in that much depth right now. But essentially, those are the two tactics available to you. But this is why moral debates are complicated. I'm not giving you these arguments to suggest that they're debate winning, although I think actually often if you prove them, they are. I'm just suggesting that they are very good arguments to pursue because often they are some of the best arguments for your side. And if the other side's good, then you just have to think, you know. Yes. Other questions? I saw a few. Yes, you in the middle.
Yeah. So like the stuff you talk about respecting rights, I see that argument made in animal rights now, where like animals do not deserve rights because they cannot respect rights. So like, how do you overcome that?
Yeah. So actually, good spot. So actually, I just want to highlight that the argument I made about retributivism is also an argument for why animals don't have rights, because they're incapable of accessing second-order reasons, or because they're incapable of respecting other agents' rights. Yeah. But yes, you are saying you had a follow-up question.
It also applies to other human beings, like children, like when they're born.
Yeah.
How do you kind of like overcome that?
My personal view has always been that children don't count as fully formed human beings anyway. So, I don't know. The standard argument, which I don't find very persuasive, is a potentiality argument. To say that you should not harm beings which have the potential of becoming morally relevant beings, but that would imply not having sex is like genocide, right? Because sperm and egg are not reaching their potentiality. So I've also found it fairly unpersuasive. I think a much better argument is actually a property rights argument, which is that children do not matter in and of themselves, but they matter because they have deep relations to beings which are morally relevant agents and do have relevant interests. So the harm of murdering a child on this account would not be that different from stealing something which someone really, really loves or damaging it. Right? But no, of course, you would be referring to children at a very young age, around about 2 to 3, where they arguably don't pass the mirror test and don't display the capacity to think normatively. So I think the closest is a relational argument. That's the argument people make as well to why we shouldn't take the organs of people who are permanently comatose or have no brainstem activity. Yeah, I think that's the best I've come across. Yes. Yeah.
So in the initial slides that we talked about the colonial reparations argument, where we discussed how it is hard to rank suffering of different people. Right. I want to know that apart from the intuition found that there are some people in the world who are already suffering, and then should you give reparations to them, ask them to the others, the colonial victims? Is there a way to categorically prove this, that you cannot rank suffering other than just like examples of how people do this?
Honestly, there isn't a different argument apart from the argument given in the how to justify utilitarianism slide about how to prove that everyone matters equally. Yeah, so you would have to use the exact same arguments from that slide in this circumstance as well. I would say the reparations debate is not a good reparations debate of that sort. Shouldn't have a huge amount of very explicit moral argumentation, but there should be a lot of argumentation based on the understanding that you have different moral frameworks, right? And being able to contest that gives you a strategic advantage. So I don't think you would have to reach really for the fundamental arguments for utilitarianism in that debate. Yeah.
In utilitarianism, what's the best way to compare human interests in satisfaction versus animal interests in satisfaction? For example, around about building a new suburb.
So many people, no one has ever argued that animals matter more than human beings. Many people have argued equivalence on the basis that, again, if you think about it, the argument for arbitrariness applies to it, right? There's the fact that you are you with genetic differences from another human being is no. What's the fundamental difference between you and an animal, right? Just speciesism. It's no different from racism, right? If you think about it. The argument which has been made from a purely utilitarian perspective as to why human being matters more is that human beings, because they're able to have much more intense and complex, or I would say not intense, but because they have more complex desires and because they have more attitudes about things like the future, when they suffer, they can suffer a lot more because they can back-propagate suffering. So now, in other words, we should care more about human suffering because when human beings know that they might suffer, they actually start suffering. Whereas an animal might not understand the notion that they were going to be slaughtered, so they suffer less from not being able to understand that they could be slaughtered, right? So because human beings have all kinds of higher order pains, which animals don't have, and higher order pleasures, which animals don't have, we should care more about human welfare than animal welfare. Some people have said that, yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
This might sound like a very lame question.
Sorry, I was taking the question. Sorry. Yeah. I thought you were maybe like to run or something. I'll take your question first, and I'll come over to you in a bit. Yeah. By the way, people, if you leave, just leave. You know, don't worry about being impolite or anything. Yeah.
Two questions. Firstly, how do I weigh different fundamental rights against each other? Because you said there are four, so technically, if I make a fundamental right, another thing can also.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. How do you weigh a fundamental right against each other? So, what happens in a debate where the right, let's say the war crimes debate, right? You say that freedom fighters it's legitimate for them to commit war crimes, like targeting civilians, whatever. What if the other side says, but your right to self-defense now implicates the right to freedom from torture, because you're defending yourself by torturing people? What do you do in that situation? There's only a couple of ways to get around it. One way, I think by far and away the easiest way, is to try and get rid of the tension by saying that whatever you're doing, it is not the equivalent of torture. The other way to go around it is to try and say in some way that your right's more important than the other right. In other way, to try and break the logic of a fundamental right by showing that actually this right's more fundamental. Then you would need to do something like a sort of retributivist argument, right? That can become a kind of deadlock. You can say, well, okay, you have right to freedom from torture, but only insofar as you are a being capable of having rights. If you yourself were complicit in mass atrocities, you forfeit those protections. So that's why the retributivist argument is often very helpful for breaking these sorts of ties. So you either win on characterization, or you try and bring in a tie-break argument like the retributivist argument. That's essentially it. Yeah. I have actually seen a debate where that has happened. It was actually a great debate, super fun, because I think there were a bunch of good debaters who never had to confront this particular situation ever. And so it's nice when good debaters are thinking of arguments for the first time and having to struggle through it. You see some fun stuff happen. But yeah, it can happen. Not super often, so thankfully you don't have to worry too much about it. You had a second question?
Yes, a second question. If another team argues for a right and proves it well, how could I weigh over that if I want a good?
Yeah, so attack the axiomatic distinction is the easiest way, I find. To say, look, you say that we're torturing people, right? Torturing terrorists. You too are also torturing people. You're torturing people who will be stuck under rubble heaps when buildings go off. You'll be torturing people who will be having machines doing the breathing for them as they lie in hospital because shrapnel has ripped through their bodies. Like, both sides are torturing people. We do it less. And as I say, a very great tactic is to go on the attack. Yeah. Okay, someone at the back, sorry. Yes, you, since... Yeah.
I will ask a rather lame question. But
Yeah.
have you found yourself running principal case and arguments rather on openings or closing? Because openings tends to like go for the lower grab like arguments and so on. But
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, that's a very good question. Actually, it reminds me of one thing I should mention as well, which I haven't mentioned, which could be important. Usually, openings only run principal arguments if the motion is one of those arguments I mentioned at the beginning, which really invites it. And then closings usually run principal arguments when the debate is a bit more wacky, but wacky in a way which gives you both practical and principal arguments. Usually, the principle is underdeveloped in opening, and the closing takes it. So I'll say that's like a good guideline. One thing I should note: actor debates. In actor debates, it's often very possible to run a strong principal argument if the actor is committed to the principle explicitly, or is committed to certain underlying premises of either a utilitarian or a deontological belief system. So a very good example of this is that this House as a feminist would strongly advocate for anti-racism initiatives. And one of the best arguments for why you should do that is because if you're a feminist, you believe in feminism for a reason. What is the basis of a feminist belief? It's the notion that arbitrary discrimination on the basis of unchanging factors is evil. If you're a feminist because you believe in belief A, then you must also believe all the other consequences of belief A. So you must also be deeply ideologically committed to racism, to anti-racism. Right? That's a classic example. So just note that sometimes active debates also invite big principle arguments as well. Not all of them by any means, but quite often. Yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Okay. You at the back. No. Yeah. Green. Yes, correctly.
How do you defend or even comment on people saying whatever choice people make, or like epistemic access? So I have the epistemic access to my needs, therefore the best choice for me is the choice that
Yeah, so there's a couple of, and it's a very good question. And I just want to note that is a very strong argument for individual choice. The fact that only I live my life from the inside, and given the incommensurability of the choices I face every day, I should be the sole governor of my life and how it goes. There's a couple of responses. The first way is to say that, yes, but the fact that you have epistemic access to you right now does not give you epistemic access to you in the future. In other words, your future self could be meaningfully different from your current self, and the government must maximize well-being over the course of an entire person's lifetime. So in effect, doing certain things right now could actually be destroying your future self. So it's almost like a third-party Hahn argument, just applied to this particular instance. Another way is to say, even if you have epistemic access to all of what you want as a goal, that does not mean you have the capacity to process information in a way which connects your goals to the things you should do to achieve those goals. And that's when cognitive biases come in, because we all acknowledge that there are certain basic principles of logic which you need to abide by, but which people in practice often don't abide by for all kinds of reasons of biology or culture, so on and so forth. So I think that those are the basic ways you try and get around the epistemic access thing. There is a more fundamental argument, which is to say that people don't actually have access to the inner self. It's actually a fairly, there's a lot of psychological research which suggests that people don't actually know what their real desires are, or what people say their desires are don't match up with what they actually do. The biggest example is privacy. If you do survey, people would say over and over again, I really, really care about privacy and not having big companies harvest my data. But if you look at how people act, they don't care at all. So you can say, what people think their desires are actually not really reflected in what they do a lot of the time. And there's actually ways in which you can use that in debates. Although I say that's relatively uncommon. Yeah. Yes, that was again. Yes, you in the middle. Yeah.
How can you make a debate about the principle? Like, how can you push the principle in a class that judge will likely perceive as important?
Yeah. This is not a facetious response at all. This is like a very sincere response, and this is from lots of hard experience. You've got to be persuasive. Right? No, it's true. You've got to spend time on it. You've got to say it like it matters. You know you have won a debate for principle from opening government if the opening opposition comes up and you start talking about it. The debate has now become about principles. And I think, honestly, a lot of it is like a huge part of it. I think the most unteachable part of it is like, do you sound like you believe the principle when you say it? Do you create moments in your speech where the judge listens to you and they sort of go, principles, and they sort of go, maybe I do kind of buy this, given all of the other examples they're bringing about when we respect this fundamental freedom? If you can create that kind of impact on the judge, then you will just successfully make the debate principle. Yeah, sorry. I'm really not trying to be facetious, but that's the best I can give you. Yeah.
Yeah, so this is on the pro-utilitarianism that we previously discussed. So kind of an uncontestable burden that we skip through is going from all people are important to you can aggregate stuff.
Yeah.
And that's also the strongest deontological response, course-card stuff.
Yeah.
So what are the ways you can go around proving you can aggregate?
I think one way is to say that we do this within our own heads. If I ask you, would you rather go on a holiday or get a promotion? Those are clearly very different kinds of happiness, right? Those are arguably incommensurable things. But you are just commensurating in your head right now. You are clearly making decisions at that moment of what you would prefer based on things like intensity. So the fact that we are able to do this internally within our heads suggests that it might be possible to abstract this out of individuals as well, to add these things up. Because otherwise, you think about it, if these things really were fundamentally incommensurable, we would be paralyzed. Right? So that suggests that maybe there is a way out.
Yeah, but the obvious response to that is you can do it for some things, right? But what those things are also vary across people. So it's the same thing, you might skip a promotion, different agents are constituted differently. So it goes back again to the question of you can only make this choice yourself.
Yeah.
And the local to global jump is really
hard. It is hard. I would say one way around the conceptual gap is a very statistical kind of response, which is to say our experience of people who've made decisions in their lives and what they regret and what people indicate as their rank preferences in things like elections suggests that there is actually much more commonality among what people value than this argument would have you think. So I think that kind of response could work as well. You just need to be careful about the way you frame what people tend to view are fundamental common goods. Yeah.
Two more questions, I think.
Two more questions. Yes, that's like it's. Oh, two questions. Can all of you fight it out. I don't know. I feel like this is... Well, I mean, you can hunt me down. I don't want to be hunted down, but you can hunt me down for questions if they're really burning. Okay.
Okay, 4. How about 4?
That's 4 questions.
These 4.
Four questions.
You can't let them browbeat you into it.
Well,
okay,
yeah, Sajid is very nice. That's why he's a 2 consecutive words Ash calls. Okay, let's take 4 questions. 4 hands. No, but why are there not 5 hands? This is absurd. Okay, I'll take you, because you are definitely one of him. No, I'm going to pick you, and you. Those 4. Okay, yes.
So I find it that I can establish a general principle that is fine, but then I have to argue, okay, and it should apply to this particular situation because it shares the core traits. The truth that oftentimes rebuts me is that they say, oh yes, but this is actually this is a different thing, you cannot apply to this particular situation. And in the end case, they just say, oh, but there is this other right and we should equally respect it. How do I prove that something general should apply to a specific situation that is...
Yeah. What you need to do is to think very carefully about why that particular right is absolute. So, do you think a right is absolute because it can be abused? Do you think a right is absolute because it violates a Kantian precept? Do you think, so for instance, the fundamental role of slavery is ownership, right? So if you're going to say something is like slavery, can you prove to me that ownership is involved? And that's one extra layer of rigor, right? You can say poverty is like slavery because when you're poor, you are in fact enslaved by whoever happens to employ you because you have no bargaining power in that transaction. And I think if you do it that way, you go from saying capitalism enslaves us all in some vague, fluffy sense to doing something much more rigorous. So the trick is just be incredibly rigorous about how you're characterizing one thing. That's really it. Like fanatical about it. Yeah.
So.
Yeah.
So you talked about situations where people claim to have one preference, but then act in a way that doesn't satisfy that.
Yeah.
Like us claiming to care about privacy, but then using social media.
Yeah.
How do you distinguish between someone not knowing what they truly desire versus failing to satisfy a higher order desire about their desires?
It's a good question. I'm not sure I've actually seen this play out in the debate, but it's a kind of interesting question, yeah. I would say in practice, if I think about it realistically, when you ask people what they want, they tend to be a bit more reflective, right? So I would say the answers which people give when you explicitly ask them what they fundamentally value are probably the realer desires. So I think if someone made an argument to say, well, people don't actually value this in the real world, I would say no, but I think what people say when they reflect upon what they want should be taken more seriously than what they actually indicate when they act. Economists will say the exact opposite. You know, revealed preferences, an argument I hate. Like, we know that these people like this thing because in real life they do this thing. So in an active debate about what they ought to do what they're clearly doing. Because, like, jihadists have revealed preference for fighting jihad, right? Nonsense like that. So I think that's a slightly lazy argument, but I think you can say that revealed preferences matter more because people often lie to themselves about what they're valuing as well. In other words, actually, second-order desires are just lies. I mean, when I was debating in 2015, the way Michael used to rebut arguments based on second-order desires would say, like, yeah, sure, you've proven it's higher level, but higher level doesn't mean more important. It just means higher level. What if I really want that base-level desire? Like, what if punching people feels really, really good, and restraining myself doesn't feel quite as good? Right? And then another response, if I had someone give, which is like, yeah, but I could have a third-order desire, the fourth-order desire. Like, how far up this Jenga tower of desire do you want to go? This is a ridiculous, incoherent concept. Right? So there are many ways to play around with it. That's a good question. Yes, sir, you and
I want to switch to judging. What
yes.
are common pitfalls in debates where there are principled arguments?
Oh, really good question, actually.
Especially like when the debate becomes about practical arguments versus principled arguments.
I would say I am actually one of the worst judges to make a principled argument to, or to try and make a principled case to, because I actually expect an argument. Many people, when they make a principled argument, just think it's a vibe, or they don't treat it seriously. Most of the time, when teams make principled arguments to me, they lose. And it's not because nothing against it. I just look at my paper, like, where no links. You yelled about how this is inhumane and disturbing, but there are no links, right? You never establish a common premise and argument. So, I would say the most important thing for judging is that you treat it seriously. You do not view it as a flashy little thing or a fancy route to a victory or as you trying something out, or trying to be cute, or covering your ass by running a principled dimension to another otherwise 7-part practical case, but that you treat it as if it's a big impact which you are trying to weigh and mechanize in exactly the same way you would weigh or mechanize any other argument. I would say break it down. What facts need to be true for my principle to apply? How must I characterize these facts as a principle to apply? And then, why is this principle absolute? And is it analogous to other situations? And what are the most obvious attacks against it? And how can I defend myself against it? All the things you do for practical arguments, do it for a principle argument. Otherwise, you're wasting your time.
Yeah. Last question.
Last question.
Yes, thank you. So I was speaking about earlier when we talked about trying to make the other team to acknowledge your principle with those theories and so on about, hey, you have to agree that this is true. So they must happen, they either have to be critical or they bite the bullet and look very bad because they admitted to something really wrong. And I was thinking back to the mind eraser, the memory eraser and the slavery analogy, right? If you're being put in that position, is there a way to bite the bullet but make a distinction such as you are not such a morally disgusting person saying like, oh, slavery is obviously a wrong in 90% of cases, but if you describe slavery in this particular situation as being you being a slave to your past self, then slavery is okay here.
Yeah, so I think the way to deal with it is the zeroing out tactic I mentioned, to suggest that there is no free choice on either side. In other words, both sides are equally bad. So, if you think about it, the response to the argument that you need to have access to a memory wiping machine because your choices are constrained is to say, but if all of your choices are just emanations of your past self, surely even your decision to wipe your past self is a coerced one. It's not an expression of who you actually are. So there is no escape from this infinite world of coercion. There's another much more complicated response, which I think is very hard to pull off, but I actually think might be kind of true, which is to say, erasing your past memories and past self is freedom only in the most shallow sense. It feels almost like a cheat to say, I now have freedom because I'm a tabula rasa. But is that real choice? It seems to me like real choice involves actually grappling with past self and having to come to terms with things like trauma or your baggage and deciding to do things in a way which might transcend or overcome certain bad habits you have. Whereas it's not really meaningful to turn yourself into tabula rasa and just subject yourself to all of the new influences which will just consume you anyway. I think there's an argument there, but I need to think more carefully about it. Yeah, to figure out if it actually makes sense from like a premises conclusions thing. Yeah. Anyway, that brings this session to an end. It has been a fun 3 hours. I hope that that's been useful. All right. Good luck for